She laughed at a man for withdrawing $50. Then the bank manager walked out of his office, something he hadn't done for a customer in 3 years, and personally shook that man's hand. The lobby went dead silent. Isabella Sterling, one of the most powerful investors in the country, felt the floor shift beneath her Louboutins. Because the man she'd just mocked in front of 30 witnesses, he had more money sitting in that single branch than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And the worst part? He heard every word she said. If you've ever been underestimated, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The Tuesday afternoon light fell through the tall windows of Meridian National Bank in downtown Chicago, the way it always did in October. Slanted and thin, like the city itself was running low on warmth. The marble floors reflected everything: the polished suits, the clicking heels, the quiet hum of money moving through the world in digital streams that most people would never see or touch. Logan Hart saw none of it. He was watching Sophie tie her shoelace. She'd insisted on doing it herself, which had been fine when they were still on the sidewalk, less fine when she'd sat down directly in the middle of the bank's revolving entrance and refused to move until the bow looked exactly right. A security guard had looked over. A woman in a cream blazer had sighed audibly and stepped around them. Logan had crouched down beside his daughter, not rushing her, not embarrassed, just watching her small fingers work the loops with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. "You got it," he said quietly. Sophie looked up. The bowl was slightly lopsided. She examined it for a moment, decided it was acceptable, and stood up like she'd just conquered something significant. "Okay," she announced. "Now we can go." They joined the line. It wasn't a long one, maybe 6 people ahead of them on a slow Tuesday. Logan shifted Sophie onto his hip out of habit, though at 6 she was getting almost too big for that, and she immediately grabbed the collar of his jacket and held on, looking around at the marble pillars and the high ceilings with the wide, unhurried curiosity that children carry before the world teaches them to pretend they've seen everything before. Logan looked ordinary. That was the most accurate word for it. Not poor, not disheveled, but ordinary in a way that seemed almost deliberate in a place designed to make you feel the weight of other people's money. His jacket was clean but old, the kind of navy that had been washed enough times to fade into something softer. His shoes were brown leather, resoled twice, scuffed at the toes. He hadn't shaved in 4 days, not from laziness, but from the particular math of single parenthood. There are only so many minutes in a morning, and he'd spent his making Sophie's lunch and finding her left shoe, which had somehow ended up behind the radiator. He looked like a man who had more important things to worry about than appearances. He was. Isabella Sterling arrived at Meridian National 11 minutes after Logan joined the line. She didn't arrive the way most people arrive at banks, by uncertain, slightly inconvenienced, searching for the right cue. She arrived the way people arrive at places they own, or places that should, by all logic, feel grateful for their presence. Her heels struck the marble in a rhythm that turned heads without trying to. Her coat was charcoal wool, custom-tailored, the kind of cut that cost more than most people's monthly rent, without advertising the fact in any obvious way. Her hair was dark and precise. Her phone was already in her hand. She was 30 years old and she ran Sterling Capital Ventures, a firm that had placed money in the right places at the right times often enough that her name appeared on lists. Forbes, Bloomberg, Chicago Business, with a frequency that had long since stopped feeling novel to her and started feeling like background noise. She joined the line behind Logan without really registering him. That was the thing about Isabella Sterling. She didn't exactly look at people so much as she assessed them. It was a habit she'd cultivated over years of pitches and boardrooms and cocktail parties where everyone was always selling something. She'd learned to read people in seconds, what they were worth, what they wanted, whether they were worth her time. It was efficient. She told herself it was efficient. She glanced at Logan, the way you glance at furniture. Then she looked at her phone. Whoa. The line moved the way bank lines move, slowly, with the particular cruelty of a queue where you can see the teller, but the person ahead of you always seems to be conducting the most complicated transaction in the history of currency. Sophie had grown bored of looking at the ceiling and had started a quiet, one-sided conversation with the button on Logan's jacket, addressing it as Mr. Button, and explaining in great detail the plot of a cartoon she'd watched that morning. Logan listened to every word. He didn't have his phone out. Isabella noticed this, eventually, the way you notice something slightly out of place in a familiar room. A grown man, standing in a bank, listening seriously to a child talk to a button. She looked at his shoes. She looked at his jacket. She did the quick, brutal math that people do when they think no one is watching. When the woman ahead of Logan finished her transaction and Logan stepped up to the counter, Isabella moved forward in line, close enough now that she could hear. The teller, a young woman, early 20s, the practiced smile of someone who has learned to look pleasant through boredom, greeted him with the standard warmth. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" "Hi." Logan shifted Sophie to his other hip. "I need to make a withdrawal. $50, please." $50. Not 5,000. Not 500. 50. Isabella didn't mean to react. She told herself later that it just came out. The small sound, halfway between a laugh and a scoff, that escaped before she could catch it. But she didn't try very hard to catch it, and she didn't bother to lower her voice when she said it. $50. The words came out flat, carrying just enough edge to be heard by the 2 or 3 people standing nearest to her. In a bank. On a Tuesday afternoon. She looked at the woman beside her, a stranger in a yellow coat who'd made the mistake of meeting her eyes, and gave a slight, incredulous shrug, the kind that says, "Can you believe this?" without requiring any actual investment in the answer. The woman in the yellow coat smiled uncomfortably and looked away, but a man in a gray suit behind Isabella chuckled, quiet, but there. And the sound spread the way, sound spread in marble rooms. Not loudly, just enough. Sophie heard it. She was 6, not deaf, and she was perceptive in the way children are before they learn to second-guess what they're noticing. She lifted her head from her father's shoulder and looked back at the woman in the nice coat. Then she looked at her father. "Daddy," she said, just loud enough, "did we do something wrong?" The lobby, for just a moment, was quiet enough to hear that clearly. Logan turned his head slightly but didn't look at Isabella. He rubbed Sophie's back with one hand, the slow, steady rhythm he'd been using since she was an infant. "No, baby," he said. "We didn't do anything wrong." His voice was even, not defensive, not tight, just honest, the way you are with a child when you want the truth to actually reach them. He turned back to the teller, who had been frozen in a small, terrible moment of witnessing something she hadn't been trained to handle. $50, Logan repeated quietly. "From my primary, please." What happened next took approximately 90 seconds. Later, several people in that lobby would describe it differently depending on where they'd been standing, but they would all agree on this. The teller looked at her screen, and then the teller's expression changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a gasp or a double take. It was subtler than that. The specific, involuntary stillness that crosses a person's face when their brain receives information that doesn't match any expectation it had been holding, like a loading screen, like a moment of recalibration. She looked at the screen. She looked at Logan. She looked at the screen again. Her fingers, which had been moving with the automatic confidence of someone who has performed this task 10,000 times, stopped moving. "One moment, sir," she said. Her voice was different. Something in the professional warmth had shifted into something more carefully attentive. "I just need to... one moment." She picked up the phone on her desk. She turned slightly away from the window and spoke in a voice too low to carry. But the body language was clear to anyone paying attention, and in the sudden silence of the lobby, several people were. Logan waited. Sophie had returned to her conversation with Mr. Button. 20 seconds passed. 30. And then the door to the branch manager's office, a door that had been closed since Isabella had walked in, a door she had been in this branch enough times to know rarely opened during regular lobby hours because Richard Calloway, the branch manager, conducted his meetings by appointment and considered it beneath his station to stand at a teller window. That door opened. Richard Calloway walked out. He was a man in his mid-50s, silver at the temples. The particular posture of someone who had been important long enough that it had settled into his bones. He walked across the lobby at a pace that wasn't hurried but wasn't casual either, and he went directly to the window where Logan was standing. "Mr. Hart," he said. Not sir, not the standard courtesy. A name, used like recognition. Logan turned. Richard, they knew each other. "I'm sorry you had to wait," Calloway said, and there was something in his tone that wasn't the scripted apology of a bank manager reciting service standards. It was the tone of a person who genuinely didn't want to have inconvenienced this particular individual. "Can I ask, are you withdrawing from your primary checking, or would you prefer we process this through one of your investment accounts?" The lobby heard this. The lobby heard this. Isabella Sterling had excellent hearing. She had always thought of it as a professional asset, the ability to catch the word under the word, the number beneath the pitch. She heard Richard Calloway ask Logan Hart whether he wanted his $50 from his primary checking or one of his investment accounts, and she felt something happen in her chest that she would spend the next 2 weeks trying to accurately name. It wasn't embarrassment yet. Embarrassment requires confirmation. It was something earlier than that. The first cold drop of a sensation that hasn't fully arrived. The split second before you understand that the ground is less stable than you believed. She looked at Logan Hart. He was still holding his daughter. His jacket was still old. His shoes were still scuffed. He hadn't changed in the 90 seconds since she'd made that sound. But the branch manager was standing at his window with his hands clasped, waiting for an answer with the attentive stillness of a man who understood who he was talking to. "Checking's fine," Logan said. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't performing anything. Not modesty, not power, not satisfaction. He just looked like a man who wanted $50 and was slightly impatient to get back to his daughter's afternoon. "Of course." Calloway nodded at the teller and turned to Logan with the practiced warmth of a man whose job required him to be pleasant to people with large amounts of money. "Will you be needing anything else while you're here? We have your portfolio review scheduled for next month, but if you'd like to move that up—" "Next month is fine," Logan said. "We're just here for the cash." "We." Sophie looked up at the word, as if she'd been included in something important, which she had been. Isabella did not move. Around her the line had shifted. People had stepped up. Transactions had continued. The ordinary mechanics of a bank had resumed. But Isabella Sterling stood slightly apart from all of it, her phone loose in her hand, her eyes on a man who wasn't looking at her. The woman in the yellow coat had disappeared. The man in the gray suit had moved to a different window. The moment had expanded and contracted, and now it was just Isabella and the particular silence in her own head. She thought about the sound she'd made. She thought about the words. $50. In a bank. On a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about the little girl asking her father if they'd done something wrong, and the way he'd said no, baby, like it was the simplest and most certain thing in the world. Richard Calloway returned to his office. The teller completed Logan's transaction with the particular care of someone who understood now that she was handling something she'd almost mishandled. Logan signed where he needed to sign. He counted the $50, 2 20s, and a 10, and folded them into his front pocket with the same lack of ceremony you'd fold a grocery receipt. He picked up Sophie, who immediately wrapped her arms around his neck. "Ice cream now?" she asked. "Ice cream now," he confirmed. He turned from the counter and walked toward the exit. He passed within 8 feet of Isabella Sterling. He didn't look at her. Not from cruelty. Logan Hart, as Isabella would eventually learn, was not a cruel man. He simply did not look at her because she wasn't relevant to the next hour of his life, which belonged entirely to a 6-year-old who wanted a scoop of something pink. He pushed through the revolving door. Sophie waved at no one in particular as they went, just waved, the way small children wave, at the general idea of a room. And then they were gone. Web. Isabella stood there for another moment. A teller called "Next, please," and she walked to the window on autopilot, gave her account number, completed the transaction she'd come for, a routine transfer, the kind of thing she could have done on her phone but preferred to handle in person, a habit from her early days when the act of walking into a bank had still felt like proof of something, and walked back out through the same revolving door. The October air hit her like a fact. She stood on the sidewalk and looked left, then right. Logan and Sophie were already gone, absorbed into the ordinary afternoon crowd. 2 people who had somewhere to be and nothing to prove. Isabella had spent 10 years building a reputation on the ability to read a room. She was, by every measure she'd ever cared about, very good at reading rooms. She had walked into that one and misread it completely. She didn't ask about him right away. There was a version of Isabella Sterling that would have immediately called her assistant and had Logan Hart's entire financial history assembled by dinner. She'd done it before, not maliciously, but out of the particular habit of someone who dealt in information and believed that understanding a person meant knowing their numbers. But something stopped her this time. Maybe it was the little girl's question, did we do something wrong? Maybe it was the way Logan had answered it, not with reassurance exactly, but with certainty. No, baby. Like the question didn't even require deliberation. She drove back to her office in the kind of silence she didn't usually tolerate in the car. She normally had calls scheduled for the commute. Today she let the radio stay off and watched the city scroll past the windows. The people on corners, the delivery cyclists, the woman pushing a stroller, the old man at the newspaper stand on Michigan Avenue who'd been there every Tuesday for as long as she could remember, though she'd never once actually registered his face before today. She thought, how many times have I done that? She didn't have an answer. That was the problem. Tots. Back in her office on the 34th floor of the Fulton Tower, with Lake Michigan glinting gray and silver through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and her assistant holding 3 message slips that all said urgent, Isabella sat down at her desk and didn't immediately reach for any of them. Her assistant, Marcus, 26, efficient to the point of seeming slightly robotic until you learned that he just hated small talk, knocked on the open door frame and looked at her with the practiced neutrality of someone trying to assess whether his boss was fine or emphatically not fine. You have a 4 o'clock with the Harmon Group, he said. I know. And a 5:30 dinner at... I know, Marcus. He paused. You want coffee? Yeah. He disappeared. She looked out at the lake. 40 minutes later, not because she'd sent Marcus to do it, but because it was, apparently, a very small world, she was sitting across from her old associate, Dana Forsythe, head of private client services at Meridian National, in a meeting that had been scheduled for 3 weeks to discuss Sterling Capital's corporate accounts. They were 15 minutes into the agenda when Dana said, casually, the way people mention things they assume you already know. I saw you were in the Michigan Avenue branch today. Did you happen to run into Logan Hart? He came in this afternoon, apparently. Calloway mentioned it. Isabella kept her expression neutral. Years of deal-making had given her an extremely good poker face. I was there, she said. I didn't know the name. Dana looked at her with the mild surprise of someone who finds that shocking. Really? Quiet guy, probably with his daughter. He's been a client there since before the Hart Technologies sale, which was, she paused, did the math. Almost 5 years ago now. Hart Technologies, Isabella repeated. You've heard of it. It wasn't a question. FinTech. They built the infrastructure that's now underneath about a third of the regional payment processors in the Midwest. The company wasn't publicly visible, Logan never did much press, but the institutional investors who were in it made out exceptionally well when Viridian bought the IP. Dana took a sip of her water. Logan himself walked away from the sale with, well, it's not public, but walking away is the right word. He just walked away. Nobody really heard from him after that. Isabella thought about the worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, the $50. What happened? She said. Dana's expression shifted slightly, not to gossip, but to the more careful register of someone relaying something that had been a genuine industry story. His co-founder. They'd built the company together from a shared apartment in Wicker Park, apparently. 12 years. And then when the acquisition offer came in, his partner, a man named Derek Chandra, maneuvered the board. Long story short, Logan still got his share of the payout, but the company, the name, the recognition, all of that went with Chandra, who then sold his interest to Viridian separately with his name on the deal. She shook her head slightly. Legal. Completely legal. Just not good. No, Isabella said. Not good. Logan just disappeared after that. Stopped attending industry events. Stopped taking calls, from what I understand. And then gradually, quietly, he started showing up in deals again. Small positions at first, then larger ones. He has a particular eye for early infrastructure plays, which makes sense given his background. Meridian manages his primary banking and some of his investment custodial accounts. She paused. He's a very private person. Doesn't advertise. You'd never know, looking at him, that he was— She seemed to choose her next word carefully. Significant. No, Isabella said very quietly. You wouldn't. The meeting ended. She shook Dana's hand. She rode the elevator back to 34. She sat at her desk for a while and didn't turn on any of her screens. She thought about Logan Hart building something from a shared apartment in Wicker Park over 12 years. She thought about what it would feel like to have someone you'd trusted that completely perform a legal, bloodless destruction of everything you'd built together. She thought about the way Logan had stood in that bank lobby. Not hunched, not angry, not armored, just there, present in the way of someone who has survived something significant and arrived, on the other side of it, at a version of himself he actually recognized. She had built her career on evaluating assets. She had walked into that bank and failed to identify the most valuable thing in the room. It wasn't the account balance. It was the man who could take 2 20s and a 10 from a teller window after everything he'd been through and put them in his pocket like they were exactly what he needed. Because what he needed was to take his daughter for ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon, and he knew it. Isabella Sterling was 30 years old, and she had spent a decade learning the price of things. She was starting to understand, slowly and not altogether comfortably, that this was not the same thing as knowing their value. Outside, somewhere in the city, a man and his daughter were at an ice cream counter. Sophie was taking an extraordinary amount of time choosing between strawberry and something called Galaxy Swirl, which appeared to be purple and covered in edible glitter. Logan was watching her with the patience of someone who understood that this decision was real and deserved real consideration. Galaxy Swirl, Sophie finally announced, with the gravity of a verdict. Good call, Logan said, and meant it. He paid with cash. 2 ones and some change exact. They found a bench near the window, and Sophie held her cone with both hands and watched the people go by outside, naming things she saw. Red umbrella, big dog, lady with the yellow bag. A running commentary on the world delivered to no one but somehow received by Logan in the way he received everything she said, fully, without distraction. He had learned, in the years since he'd become the only parent Sophie had, that the world would constantly try to convince him there were more important things than this bench, this Tuesday, this small person eating purple ice cream and narrating the street. The world was wrong about that. He'd run the numbers. This was the highest value allocation of his time. He was certain of it. His ice cream was chocolate. He was almost done. Sophie got a small Galaxy Swirl drip on her jacket sleeve and examined it with mild scientific interest. It's purple now, she observed. It is, he agreed. Is that bad? It'll wash out. She considered this and returned to her cone. Acceptable loss. Logan looked out the window. He wasn't thinking about the bank. He wasn't thinking about the woman with the nice coat and the sharp edge in her voice. He'd had worse. He'd had so much worse than a stranger's assumption on a Tuesday afternoon that the experience had barely registered as anything other than a minor inconvenience, a thing that happened, a thing Sophie had noticed, a thing he'd answered as honestly as he could. No, baby, we didn't do anything wrong. That was the whole of it. He finished his ice cream. Sophie, who had been focused, finished hers 6 minutes later with the concentration of a professional. She had not, Logan noted, gotten any more on her jacket. Just the one drip, very controlled. Good work, he said. I practiced, she said, which was not true in any verifiable sense, but had a kind of internal logic he respected. They left the ice cream shop and walked back toward the parking garage, Sophie's hand in his, the October light going golden now as the afternoon shifted toward evening. She walked the way she did everything, at her own pace, looking at things that interested her, occasionally stopping without warning to examine a leaf or a crack in the pavement, trusting completely that he would stop with her. He always did. That was the thing about Logan Hart that didn't show in any account balance or any portfolio review or any industry article. The most significant thing he did every day was invisible. He showed up. For this kid, in this city, on this sidewalk, in the ordinary imperfect Tuesday of it, he showed up completely, without reservation. And that, as it turned out, was everything. The lobby of Meridian National Bank returned to its usual hum within minutes of Logan's departure. Transactions were completed. Phones rang. The revolving door spun people in and out. Richard Calloway returned to his office and closed the door. The teller who had handled Logan's withdrawal spent the rest of her shift slightly more careful about everything, a reaction she wouldn't have been able to fully explain if asked. And Isabella Sterling drove home that evening through the amber grid of Chicago at rush hour, arrived at her apartment on the 22nd floor with its long windows and its curated silence, poured a glass of water she forgot to drink, and sat on the edge of her sofa for a while in her coat. She was thinking. She had a feeling it would take some time. Isabella Sterling did not sleep well that night. This was not in itself unusual. She had never been a great sleeper. Her brain operated on a schedule that did not respect the concept of rest, and she'd long since made peace with the 2 a.m. ceiling-staring sessions that punctuated her weeks. She had a system for them. Get up, make tea, read whatever report she hadn't finished, go back to bed around 3, function on 5 hours and coffee. It was not healthy. She knew it was not healthy. She had a very expensive doctor who told her regularly that it was not healthy, and she smiled at him and paid his invoice and did not change anything. But that Wednesday morning, the ceiling she was staring at felt different. She kept coming back to the same image, Richard Calloway, walking out of his office. The particular purposefulness of it. The way he'd said Mr. Hart, not sir, not the standardized courtesy, but a name. Used like recognition. Used like the man on the other side of the teller window was someone worth crossing a lobby for. She kept coming back to the sound she'd made. It had been so small. That was almost the worst part. She hadn't launched into a speech, hadn't done anything theatrical, just a sound, a breath shaped into contempt. The kind of thing you could dismiss as nothing, as a bad moment, as not representative of who you really are, except that it had come easily, hadn't it? It had come the way things come when they've had practice. She got up at 2:47 a.m. and made tea she didn't drink and stood at the kitchen window looking at the city lights and tried to be honest with herself in the way she usually avoided at that hour. When had she started doing that? The quick math, the instant categorization. She thought about the early days. 22 years old, new to Chicago, wearing clothes from Target to meetings with people who wore clothes that cost more than her monthly rent, learning very fast what the signals were, what they meant, how the room read them. She had been on the receiving end of those assessments. She remembered it with a clarity that years of success hadn't quite managed to smooth over. The way people's eyes would move over her and move on. The particular quality of not being taken seriously. She had promised herself she would never do that to anyone. She stood at the kitchen window at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday and understood that she had not kept that promise, and that it had happened so gradually she hadn't noticed the drift. This was not a comfortable thing to understand. She went back to bed at 3:40. She did not sleep until nearly 5. Her alarm went off at 6:15, and she got up, made coffee, and did not mention any of this to anyone. Instead, the week moved the way weeks move when you're trying not to think about something. Fast and cluttered and full of motion that keeps the stillness at bay. Isabella had a deal closing on Thursday, a board presentation on Friday, a weekend flight to New York for a conference that she had agreed to keynote 3 months ago when it had seemed like a reasonable commitment and now felt like a punishment. She was good at all of it. She showed up, she performed, she delivered. The keynote got a standing ovation from a room full of people who had paid $1,500 a ticket to hear her talk about the future of impact investing. And she stood at the podium and said all the right things about value and people and long-term thinking, and several people came up to her afterward to say it was the most honest talk they'd heard all conference. She smiled and thanked them and caught a cab to the airport and stared out the window at the New York streets and thought, am I actually any of what I just said? The honest answer was, sometimes. Partially. In the ways that were convenient. She landed back in Chicago on Sunday evening, and on Monday morning she did something she hadn't planned to do. She called Dana Forsyth. I need to ask you something, Isabella said when Dana picked up. And I want you to understand that I'm not asking because I'm looking to approach him for a deal. There was a brief pause on Dana's end, the pause of someone recalibrating the nature of a call they thought they understood. Okay, Dana said. The man from last week, Logan Hart, you said he was in deals, infrastructure plays, early stage. Is there anything public? Anything I could look at without... I'm not trying to pull his financials, I just want to understand what he's been doing. Another pause, shorter this time. There are a few things. He's not attached to any of them publicly, which is typical for him. He invests as a silent partner very deliberately. But there's a company called Bridgepoint Infrastructure Solutions that did a Series B 18 months ago. Industry people know he was in it early. There's also a fund, Lakeshore Capital Partners, where he has a significant stake. They don't publicize their investor roster, but it's not exactly secret either. Isabella wrote down both names. Lakeshore Capital Partners, she repeated. Yes. A beat. Isabella, can I ask why? Because I said something at the bank, Isabella said. She hadn't planned to say this. She said it anyway. When he was at the counter, something unkind, and I've been thinking about it. The silence on Dana's end was the particular silence of someone choosing their words carefully. What did you say? I made a comment about the withdrawal amount. It was dismissive, and his daughter heard it. She paused. She's 6. Ah, Dana said. Yeah. And you're calling me because I want to understand who I actually said it to, not to feel worse about myself. She stopped, tried again. I made an assumption. I want to understand what the assumption missed. Dana was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. What the assumption missed, she said slowly, is that Logan Hart spent 12 years building something with his hands and his mind and his trust, and then had it taken from him by the person he trusted most, and then spent 4 years putting himself back together in complete silence while raising a child alone. And he shows up to the bank in a jacket that's seen better days because he genuinely does not care what you think about his jacket. Another beat. That's what the assumption missed. Isabella didn't say anything. He's a good person, Dana said. I've dealt with a lot of clients in this industry. He's one of the genuinely good ones. Not because he's not sharp, he's extremely sharp, but because he seems to have decided that being good at the work doesn't require being unkind to the people around it. I know, Isabella said. You couldn't have known that in the bank. No, but that's exactly the problem. She looked up Lakeshore Capital Partners that afternoon. It took about 40 minutes of reading. Their public filings, a few industry articles that mentioned the fund in passing, a profile from 2 years ago in a mid-tier financial publication that had described Lakeshore as quietly becoming one of the more consequential infrastructure-focused private funds in the Midwest, with a portfolio that punches well above its public visibility. And then she found the connection that made her set down her coffee cup and sit very still for a moment. Lakeshore Capital Partners had been an early participant in a funding round 4 years ago for a company called Vantage Meridian Infrastructure. Vantage Meridian had been, at the time, a mid-sized regional logistics firm that Isabella's own firm, Sterling Capital Ventures, had been trying to get into. They'd missed the round, come in too late, moved on. Standard story. Deals fell through. You moved on. Except Vantage Meridian, 6 months after that round, had landed a contract with 3 major municipalities that effectively tripled its value in 18 months. Sterling Capital had watched from the outside and written it off as a miss. Lakeshore, Logan's fund, had been in from the beginning, and Sterling Capital's own expansion into the upper Midwest market, the push that had effectively doubled their regional footprint between 3 and 4 years ago, she dug back through the documents now, cross-referencing, and there it was. Lakeshore had been a co-investor in Hartwell Corridor Group, one of the supporting infrastructure firms that had provided the underlying logistics capacity that Sterling Capital's Midwest expansion had depended on. She hadn't known. There was no reason she would have known. These were passive investments, silent partnerships, the kind of quiet positioning that doesn't make headlines. But the math was clear enough when you put it together. Logan Hart's money had, in some indirect but real sense, been working underneath the expansion of her business. She sat with this for a long time. She was very good at following money. She had spent a decade learning to trace the invisible threads that connected one investment to another, to understand how capital moved through systems in ways that were rarely visible from the surface. She had stood in a bank lobby and looked at a man and seen nothing worth her attention, and his money had been helping her build her empire. Marcus knocked on the door at 4:30 with a stack of contracts that needed her signature and the careful expression of someone who'd noticed his boss had been unusually quiet all day. "You doing okay?" he asked. This was not a question Marcus typically asked. He was not, as previously established, a fan of small talk. The fact that he was asking meant she'd been more visibly off than she'd realized. "I'm fine," she said, then reconsidered. "I'm thinking through something." "Deal thing or a person thing?" She looked at him. "Why are those the only two options?" "In my experience, with you, those are the only two things that slow you down." She almost laughed. Not quite. "Person thing," she said. "Sort of. Both, maybe." She took the contracts and signed the first three without reading them, then caught herself and actually read the fourth. "Marcus, do you think I'm—" She stopped. "Do I think you're what?" She didn't finish the sentence. She signed the contract. "Never mind. Thanks." He took the contracts and left, but he paused in the doorway. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "you're better than you think you are, and worse than you think you are, just like everybody else." He left before she could respond to this, which was probably intentional. She looked at the closed door for a moment. Then she looked back at her screen, at the Lakeshore Capital Partners filing open in her browser, at the quiet digital footprint of a man who had built things twice over and asked nothing from the world in return except to be left alone to raise his daughter. She owed him an apology. She knew she owed him an apology. She had known it since about 45 minutes after he'd walked out of that bank lobby, but knowing and doing were separated by a distance she hadn't figured out how to cross yet. "What did you say?" "I'm sorry I made a sound when you withdrew $50. It sounded both trivial and enormous, depending on the angle. Trivial because it had been 30 seconds of her life. Enormous because it had been 30 seconds of his daughter's life. And Sophie had asked her father if they'd done something wrong, and that question would have landed in Logan Hart's chest like a stone. She knew how that felt. She remembered being 8 years old in a diner in Milwaukee, her mother counting change on the table to make sure they had enough for the check, and the woman in the booth across from them who had watched the counting with a particular look on her face, not cruel, not dramatic, just a look, and how Isabella had understood the look without being able to name it yet, and how it had made her feel like something was wrong with them, with her, with the particular life they were living. Nothing had been wrong with them. They were just counting change. She thought about Sophie asking her father if they'd done something wrong, and she thought about that diner in Milwaukee, and she sat at her desk at 4:45 in the afternoon in her 34th floor office and felt, very clearly and without theatrics, like the woman in the other booth. The realization had weight to it. She let it have weight. She found his contact information through Dana, who provided it with a measured absence of comment that Isabella appreciated. She did not call him. Calling felt like making him receiver on her terms, on her timeline, with no preparation. She drafted an email instead, which she rewrote 6 times over the course of 2 evenings. The first draft was too long. The second was too formal and read like a legal document. The third tried too hard to explain herself and came out sounding like she was asking for absolution rather than offering an apology. The fourth was better, but ended badly. The fifth she was almost satisfied with, until she read it the next morning and realized she'd spent 2 paragraphs explaining the context of her life in a way that was essentially asking him to feel sorry for her, which was not the point. The 6th draft was 4 sentences. She sent it before she could rewrite it a 7th time. It said, "Mr. Hart, my name is Isabella Sterling. We were at Meridian National Bank on the Michigan Avenue branch last Tuesday. I said something unkind while you were at the counter, and your daughter heard it. I am sorry. That's all. I don't have an explanation that would make it better, so I won't offer one. I.S." She pressed send and put her phone face down on her desk and didn't look at it for an hour. Logan read the email at 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday, sitting at his kitchen table after Sophie had gone to bed. He had his laptop open and a half-drunk cup of tea beside him and a stack of papers he'd been meaning to go through for a week. And he was tired in the particular way of someone who is always tired but has accepted this as the texture of his life. He read the email twice. Then he set down his tea and looked at the wall for a moment. He remembered her. He had not forgotten her. He'd forgotten the specifics of her face fairly quickly, But he remembered the sound, and he remembered the way it had moved through the lobby, and he remembered Sophie's question. He had answered that question, and then, as much as possible, released it, because he had a child to raise and an afternoon to protect, and he did not have the bandwidth to carry strangers' bad manners around with him. But he remembered. He thought about whether to respond. He could ignore it. It was a reasonable option. She was a stranger. The incident was over. Sophie had eaten Galaxy Swirl ice cream and named things she saw through a window and gone to bed that night without mentioning the bank once, which was either because she'd forgotten or because she was more resilient than he gave her credit for. Probably both. He read the email a third time. I don't have an explanation that would make it better, so I won't offer one. He respected that. He'd been on the receiving end of a lot of explanations in his life that were dressed up as apologies and were actually arguments. I did this because of that, so really, if you think about it, he'd gotten very good at recognizing that structure. This wasn't that. He typed a reply. It took him about 3 minutes. Ms. Sterling, thank you for the message. Apology accepted. I've had the experience of being dismissed based on appearance enough times that I've stopped letting it occupy much space. But I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell anyone who did what you did. You didn't judge my account. You judged who you thought I was. Those are very different things to get wrong. I hope that's useful. Logan Hart. He sent it and went back to his stack of papers. He did not expect a response that evening. He got one in 22 minutes. Look. Isabella read his reply standing in her kitchen, having given up on the pretense of not checking her phone. She read it once fast and then once slow, and then set the phone on the counter and stood there. You didn't judge my account. You judged who you thought I was. Those are very different things to get wrong. She thought about this for a long time. The account was the easy part to be wrong about. Accounts had numbers. Numbers could be checked, corrected, updated. Being wrong about a number was embarrassing but fixable. Being wrong about a person, about who they were, what they were worth, what they deserved, that was a different category of error. That was a mistake that lived in you, in the structure of how you moved through the world and registered the people in it. She typed back, "That's more useful than you know. Thank you for responding at all." You didn't have to. His reply came 12 minutes later. No, but it seemed like you were trying to be honest, so it felt like the right thing. She stared at that sentence for a while. She typed, "Can I ask you something?" A longer pause this time. 3 minutes? 4. She was about to put the phone down when it buzzed. "You can ask." "How do you do it?" she typed. "Just be that unbothered, standing in that lobby. It seemed like it didn't touch you." Another pause. She could almost feel him deciding something. "It touched me," he wrote back. "My daughter asked me if we'd done something wrong. That touched me. But I've learned not to let people who don't know me define what I'm worth. I spent a long time learning that. It wasn't natural. A moment, and then another message. Also, I had somewhere I needed to be. She wanted ice cream. That helps. Having somewhere that matters more." Isabella read this and set the phone down very gently on the counter. She walked to her window and stood there looking at the city and thought about what it would feel like to have somewhere that mattered more. She had places she needed to be, constantly. Meetings, presentations, flights, dinners. She had a calendar that was a monument to necessity. But somewhere that mattered more, in the way he meant it. Somewhere that pulled you through the unpleasant things, not because you were escaping them, but because something on the other side was simply more real. She thought about that for a long time. She didn't contact him again that week. She had said what she needed to say, and he had responded with more grace than she deserved, and there was a line between resolution and imposition that she was very careful not to cross. But something had shifted in the weeks that followed, and it moved through her work in ways she hadn't anticipated. There was a pitch meeting on a Monday 3 weeks after the bank. A young founder, 25, presenting a logistics software concept. He came in wearing a jacket that didn't fit quite right, and shoes that were clean but inexpensive, and he was nervous in the way of someone who knows how far they are from fitting into a room. Isabella's team sat across from him, 4 people in tailored clothes with the practiced disinterest of people who had heard 1,000 pitches, and the founder, whose name was James Okafor, began speaking. He was, within about 6 minutes, one of the most technically coherent presenters Isabella had seen in a year. His grasp of the infrastructure problem he was solving was precise and deep, and his projections, while optimistic, were grounded in real data rather than the wishful thinking that perfumed most early-stage decks. Isabella watched her team. She watched the way one of them, David, her VP of early stage, 8 years with the firm and very good at his job, was writing something on his notepad. She watched the way another was checking his phone under the table. She watched James Okafor watch them watch him, and she watched the specific adjustment that happened in his posture, the almost imperceptible correction that said, "They're not impressed, recalibrate, manage expectations. This is probably a no." She knew that adjustment. She'd made it herself at 22 in rooms like this one. "James," she said, cutting across David's next question, "walk me back to slide 7. The municipal contract projection. What are you basing the timeline on?" He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd walked in. "The Carver County pilot," he said. "We're 60 days into it. The integration timeline has run exactly on the model so far." "You're live in Carver County already?" "Since August." David looked up from his notepad. The person checking their phone put it away. "That wasn't in the materials," David said. "No," James said with a careful steadiness. "I was going to get to it on slide 12. Isabella looked at David. David looked back at her with the expression of someone who has just realized he'd been about to miss something. They spent another 40 minutes in that room, the meeting that had been scheduled for 30. Isabella asked most of the questions. James Okafor, once the room's energy shifted, stopped adjusting his posture and started talking about his company the way you talk about something you've built from a real place with real conviction, because you understand it from the inside out. When he left, David turned to her. "That was better than I expected." "I know," she said. "What were you writing on your notepad in the first 5 minutes?" He paused. "His jacket," he said, after a moment. "Honest, at least." She nodded. "So were you wrong about the jacket, or were you wrong about what the jacket meant?" He thought about this. "Both, I guess." "Yeah," she said. "Me too, once." She gathered her papers. "Set up a follow-up with his team. I want to see the Carver County pilot data before end of month." David nodded, and she could see him recalibrating something. Not dramatically, not with the fanfare of a person who has had a revelation, but in the quiet internal way that actual changes happen when they happen at all. Small adjustments. She understood those now. She had been making them herself for 3 weeks. It was Marcus who finally said the thing that had been unspoken between them. It was a Wednesday, late. The office had emptied out and they were both still there, Isabella going through a document and Marcus doing the end-of-day closeout that he did with religious regularity, logging calls, updating the schedule, making the list of tomorrow's priorities that she would look at 6 a.m. and quietly reorganize. He appeared in the doorway of her office with his coat on and his bag over one shoulder. "Different week," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. "Is it that obvious?" "To me," he shrugged. "You listened to David's whole pitch recap this morning without interrupting once. That's a record." He was making a good point. He was making the same kind of point he always makes. You usually finish his sentences. He paused. Something happened. She considered not telling him. She considered the professional distance she usually kept, the careful separation between the person in the office and the person who stood at the kitchen window at 3 a.m. making tea. She didn't drink. "I made a mistake," she said, "a while ago, small one, but it turned out to be connected to a larger one that I'd been making without knowing it." Marcus waited. "I've been reading people wrong," she said. "Or not. Not wrong, exactly. I've been reading the surface of people and calling it reading the people, and I've been doing it long enough that I stopped noticing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The bank thing," he said. She stared at him. "How did you—" "You came back different from the bank. That Tuesday." He adjusted his bag strap. "You come back from hard meetings sharp. You come back from good meetings energized. You came back from the bank quiet. That was different." He said this without accusation, just observation, the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent enough time near a person to read their weather. It was one moment, she said. That's all. Just 30 seconds. Yeah, he said. But sometimes 30 seconds is enough time to actually see something. He said goodnight and left. She sat in her office for another 20 minutes, the city dark and glittering outside the windows, the building quiet around her except for the distant sound of the cleaning crew somewhere down the hall. She thought about Logan Hart at the ice cream counter, paying with cash and change, exact. She thought about Sophie announcing Galaxy Swirl like a verdict. She thought about a man who had built a company from a shared apartment and then lost it to someone he'd trusted completely, and who had come out the other side of that not bitter, not armored, not performing some cultivated nonchalance, but genuinely, functionally okay, because he'd decided what was real and he'd organized his life around it. She thought about what it would take to become that kind of person. She did not know the answer, but she was starting to believe the question mattered, which was not something she would have said with confidence 2 weeks ago. Outside, Chicago went on being Chicago, indifferent to its skyline, alive in the way cities are alive at midnight, full of people going about the business of their lives in all the variety and ordinariness and occasional unexpected grace that entails. Somewhere in it, in a house she didn't know the address of, a 6-year-old girl named Sophie was asleep, and her father was probably still at the kitchen table, working through a stack of papers, drinking tea that had gone cold, present in the quiet way of someone who has found, after considerable loss, the particular things worth being present for. Isabella turned off her office light. She had a lot of work ahead of her, not the kind measured in quarterly reports or deal closings, though there was plenty of that too. The other kind, the slower, less quantifiable kind that Marcus had pointed at, and that James Okafor's jacket had made visible, and that one short email exchange with a man she barely knew had cracked open in her in a way she was still adjusting to. She took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, pushed through the glass doors into the October air. The city was cold and lit and indifferent and full. She walked to her car, and for the first time in a long time, she looked at the people she passed. The story of Logan Hart and Derek Chandra did not exist in any newspaper archive. That was the first thing Isabella noticed when she started looking. Not immediately, not in the obsessive way she might have approached a due diligence report, but gradually, in the spaces between meetings, in the quiet Sundays when the apartment was too silent and her laptop was already open. She had told herself she wasn't investigating him. She was just trying to understand. She had spent her entire career learning that context was everything, that a number without its history was just a number, that a company without its story was just a valuation. And she applied this, carefully and with some self-awareness about the line she was walking, to the incomplete picture she had of Logan Hart. What she found, or more accurately what she didn't find, was itself informative. There were traces. A filing here, a dissolved partnership record there. The original incorporation documents for Hart Technologies LLC, registered in Cook County 11 years ago, listed 2 co-founders, Logan James Hart and Derek Allen Chandra. The company's early years were quiet, no press releases, no funding announcements, no founder profiles and startup publications. They had bootstrapped, apparently, built without the noise that most companies use to signal that they existed. There was a single mention in a fintech industry newsletter from about 8 years ago, a brief paragraph, the kind of organic write-up that happens when someone who knows about something thinks other people should know about it too, without any PR machinery behind it. It described Hart Technologies as a small Chicago-based firm that has quietly become the infrastructure layer underneath an increasing number of regional payment processors, notable for its stability and the unusual elegance of its technical architecture. The newsletter had not named anyone specifically. It had called the company a rare example of something built to actually work rather than to be acquired. They had been acquired anyway. The Veridian acquisition had a public record. The IP transfer was filed. The corporate dissolution was documented. But the internal story, the board maneuvering, the betrayal, whatever had happened in the weeks or months before the deal that had resulted in Derek Chandra's name on the announcement and Logan's absence from it, that was nowhere. That was the kind of thing that lives only in the memories of the people who were in the room. Isabella understood enough about how these things went to fill in the outline. She had seen it before, in smaller and larger registers. A founding team that had started as equals and slowly become unequal as the money got closer and the stakes got real. The particular vulnerability of a person who had trusted someone completely and therefore had not built the defensive structures that distrust would have required. She knew the mechanics. The mechanics were not complicated. The mechanics were just cruel. What she couldn't construct from documents was what it had cost Logan. Not financially, the payout had been sufficient. She understood that much from what Dana had told her and from the evidence of Lakeshore and the other investments. The money had survived. She meant the other cost. The 12 years of mornings and late nights and decisions made and problems solved and faith placed in someone sitting across from you in a shared apartment. And then the particular day when you understood that this person had been moving quietly against you, had seen the value of what you'd built, and found a way to take the name of it for themselves. She thought about what that felt like, and she thought she had some version of the answer because she'd had a business partner once, briefly, in her second year, who had done something smaller but rhyming. She had recovered. It had not destroyed her, but she still remembered the specific texture of that betrayal. Not the anger which had passed, but the recalibration of the world it had required. The understanding that trust was not self-reinforcing, that choosing to trust someone was a risk that didn't always resolve in your favor, and that this was not a lesson you could unlearn once you'd learned it. Logan had learned it at a cost that made hers look minor, and he had come out the other side choosing to trust Sophie, choosing to be the kind of father whose first response to his daughter's fear was not defensiveness or anger, but a steady, certain no, baby, we didn't do anything wrong. He had taken the worst thing anyone had done to him and not let it become the filter through which he saw his daughter's world. That, Isabella thought, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning with her coffee going cold, was actually extraordinary, not in the way things get called extraordinary by people who mean impressive. Extraordinary in the literal sense, beyond the ordinary, not what most people managed. She wasn't sure she could have managed it. She wasn't sure she was managing it now, with the much smaller wound she was still working through. She was at her office on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after the bank, when the call came in from Robert Vance. Robert Vance was 61 years old and the chairman of Vance Meridian Capital Group, which was a different and much larger entity than the logistics company Isabella had noted in her research, a coincidence of similar naming that she had initially found confusing. He was one of the most established private equity figures in the Midwest, operating out of Milwaukee, and his calls were not events you received casually. Isabella had met him 3 times in her career, once at a conference, once at a dinner where they'd been seated 2 places apart, and once in a formal meeting 2 years ago when he'd been evaluating Sterling Capital as a potential co-investment partner for something that had ultimately not materialized. She had respected him from the first meeting. He was old school in the ways that were actually good, patient, rigorous, not interested in being the smartest person in the room, which usually meant he was, and he had a reputation for finding people early that had proven itself out over 20 years of returns that made his peers slightly sick. "Isabella," he said when she picked up. His voice was the same as she remembered, unhurried, slightly graveled, the voice of someone who had stopped performing relaxation and actually arrived at it. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all." She sat up straighter without meaning to. "Robert, good to hear from you. I'll be quick because I know you're busy and I'm getting old and I've stopped having long preambles." A pause that might have been a smile. "I'm putting together a project. Infrastructure adjacent, early stage, significant capital requirement, and I need a co-lead who understands the regional Midwest market from the inside. Your name came up from 3 different people in the last month, which in my experience means something." "I'm flattered," Isabella said, which was true. "You shouldn't be flattered yet. Flattery comes after you hear what I'm asking." Another pause. "There's someone else I'm considering for the co-lead position. I'll be honest with you about that because I think people deserve to know where they stand. The other candidate has a different skill set, more technical background, less public profile. The reason I'm calling you both is that I think the project might actually benefit from that combination, but I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to structure it as a co-lead or a single lead with advisors." "Who's the other candidate?" Isabella asked. "Logan Hart." The office was very quiet. Isabella heard the name and felt the particular sensation of a world that is smaller than you think, arranging itself into a pattern you couldn't have predicted. She was quiet for 1 second. 2. I know the name, she said. Most people in this city do, if they're paying attention, Robert said, though he does his best to make that difficult. You've crossed paths? Briefly. She chose her next words carefully. We were at the same bank branch a few weeks ago. We've had some communication since. She paused. I owe him an apology that I've already delivered, so that's resolved. But you should know there's a context there. Vance was quiet for a moment. I appreciate the transparency, he said. Does the context create a problem? Not from my end, she said. I can't speak to his. Fair. He paused again. I'll set up individual conversations with both of you first. Then we'll see where it goes. Are you interested? Tell me more about the project, she said. He told her. She listened for 12 minutes, asking 3 questions, and by the end of the call, she was genuinely interested. Not performer interested, not let's keep the option open interested, but the real kind. The kind that made her want to open a new document and start mapping the variables. She set the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Logan Hart. Of course. She did not contact Logan before the Vance meeting. She considered it, thought about sending a quick message to say, we may be in the same orbit again soon, wanted to mention it, and decided against it. It felt like maneuvering. She was trying, with varying success, to stop maneuvering around people and start just dealing with them straight. Her meeting with Robert Vance happened the following Thursday in Milwaukee, in a conference room that looked like it had been decorated in 1987 and never updated, which she had come to understand was a deliberate aesthetic choice of a man who wanted people to focus on the conversation rather than the furniture. Vance sat across from her with a legal pad and a pen and asked questions for 2 hours in the patient, methodical way of someone who had done this many times and was not in a hurry. He asked about her Midwest portfolio. He asked about her decision-making process on early infrastructure plays. He asked her about a deal she'd passed on 4 years ago that had turned out well for the people who'd taken it. Not critically, just curiously, the way someone asks about a road you didn't take. Carver Logistics, she said. We were too late in the round and I decided not to push to get in. In retrospect, the team was stronger than I'd assessed. She paused. I've been thinking about that category of error recently. What category is that? Misreading people based on surface information. She said it plainly, without the practiced hedge she would have used a month ago. I've been very good at reading deals. I've been inconsistent at reading the people behind them. Vance looked at her with the steady attention of someone who doesn't miss things. That's an honest thing to say in an evaluation meeting, he said. I'm trying to be more honest in evaluation meetings, she said. It's a work in progress. He wrote something on his legal pad. She couldn't see what it was. What would you bring to this project that Logan Hart couldn't, he asked. Not unkindly, just directly. Market relationships, she said. Public profile, for whatever that's worth on the municipal contract side. And I think I'm better at the external-facing components, negotiating the partnerships with the institutions that aren't purely financial. She paused. What would he bring that I couldn't? Vance raised an eyebrow, just slightly. I'm not usually the one being asked questions in these meetings. I figured you'd already evaluated me enough to know I was going to ask that. He almost smiled. Technical depth that's genuinely operational. He's built the kind of infrastructure this project is adjacent to. He doesn't just understand it as an investment class. He understands it from the inside. And he has relationships in the regional market that are very quiet and very deep. He paused. He's also, in my experience, someone whose judgment I trust on human questions, not just financial ones. Human questions, she repeated. Whether a team can actually do what they say they can, whether the founding group of a company is what their deck presents them to be. He's been wrong a few times. He's not magic, but his read on people tends to be accurate. A pause. He came from a situation where that skill was hard-won. I know something about that situation, Isabella said. Then you know it produced a person who doesn't trust easily, but trusts genuinely when he does, Vance said. In this business, that's worth quite a lot. Go. She drove back to Chicago in the gray November afternoon thinking about what Vance had said. Trust genuinely when he does. She thought about Logan building Heart Technologies with Derek Chandra over 12 years, two people in a shared apartment who became two people in a real company, and the particular intimacy of that. The way you know someone after 12 years of building something together, the way their judgment becomes part of your judgment, the way you stop double-checking the things you've agreed on because the agreement itself has become a form of trust. And then she thought about Derek Chandra seeing the acquisition coming and choosing, in whatever quiet sequence of decisions that entailed, to position himself ahead of it, at Logan's expense. She had spent the last 3 weeks thinking about what Logan had lost. She hadn't spent much time thinking about Derek. She thought about him now. She didn't know Derek Chandra. She knew his name from Dana and from her research, but she had no picture of him, no meeting, no data point beyond the bare outline of what he'd done. She couldn't tell herself a story about why, not with any honesty. She didn't know if he'd been scared or greedy, or if he'd convinced himself he deserved it, or if he'd simply seen the opportunity and taken it the way some people take opportunities without fully reckoning with the cost. People were capable of remarkable self-justification. She had some personal evidence of this. What she knew was the result. Logan at 40, 32 now, so late 20s then, standing on the other side of a thing that had taken 12 years to build and watching it be filed under someone else's name. And then making the choice, not once, but every day, apparently, for the years since, to rebuild without bitterness, to stay in the work, but leave the performance of the work behind, to spend what was left of his 30s raising his daughter and investing his money in quiet, careful ways that didn't require anyone to know his name. She didn't know what had happened to Derek Chandra. She hadn't looked. It hadn't seemed like the point. Logan's meeting with Vance happened 2 days after Isabella's, on a Saturday morning, which was unusual. Vance had asked if the weekend worked, and Logan had said yes because Saturdays were harder to arrange than Tuesdays, and he'd had to call his neighbor Carol to watch Sophie for 3 hours, which meant he owed Carol another batch of the oatmeal cookies she'd mentioned liking at a neighborhood thing in September, and which Logan had not yet gotten around to making. He drove to Milwaukee with the radio on and thought about the project the way he always thought about potential investments, not from the angle of what it could return, though he thought about that too, but from the angle of what it was actually trying to do and whether the thing it was trying to do was real or whether it was a story told around a real-sounding idea. He'd learned the difference, expensively, and he'd developed over the years a fairly reliable instinct for when he was hearing the former and when the latter. He liked Robert Vance. He'd dealt with him once before, 3 years ago, on a smaller matter that had gone straightforwardly and from which Logan had taken away the impression of a man who meant what he said and said what he meant and didn't feel the need to impress anyone in the process. In Logan's experience, this quality was rarer than it should be. He sat in the wood-paneled conference room and listened to Vance describe the project with the same 2-hour patience he'd offered Isabella, and asked different questions than she had. More technical, more granular, more interested in the operational architecture of what was being proposed, and less in the market positioning. Vance answered everything directly and said, "I don't know," twice, which Logan counted as a positive sign. Near the end, Vance said, "I want to be straightforward with you about something. Isabella Sterling is also being considered for the co-lead position." Logan was quiet for a moment. "I figured it might be something like that," he said. "You know her. We've met once. We've corresponded briefly." He paused. "She said something unkind to my daughter in a bank lobby. She apologized afterward, in a way that seemed genuine." Vance looked at him steadily. "Does that create a problem?" "Not if the project makes sense," Logan said. "People make mistakes. The apology told me more about her than the mistake did." He paused, considering. "I don't know her work well enough to know if the collaboration makes sense. I know her reputation." "Her reputation is strong." "Her reputation is strong," Logan agreed. "Reputations are useful starting points." He looked at the table briefly, then back at Vance. "What's she like to work with?" Vance considered this. "Direct. Demanding in ways that are usually productive. Has a tendency to move faster than her team, which creates friction. Getting better at that, from what I understand. Competitive in a way that can be either motivating or corrosive depending on the environment." He paused. She asked about you in her meeting. What did she ask? What you'd bring that she couldn't. He said it simply, as a fact. Logan was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? The truth. Vance picked up his pen and turned it over once between his fingers. I told her you have good judgment about people, that it was hard-won. Logan looked out the window at the Milwaukee skyline. Smaller than Chicago's, more modest, the kind of city that didn't feel the need to announce itself. That's accurate, he said. She seemed to take it seriously. Good. Logan reached for his jacket. Send me the project materials. I'll give you an answer in a week. That's faster than I expected, Vance said. I know what I'm looking for pretty quickly these days, Logan said. I've had enough practice telling the difference between things that are real and things that aren't. Vance nodded. He seemed satisfied with this, in the way of someone who had asked the question he actually wanted to ask and received an answer that landed correctly. They shook hands, and Logan walked out through the dated lobby and into the November cold and called Carol to check on Sophie. She's fine, Carol said before he could ask. We're making something. She says it's a boat. A boat. Out of cardboard boxes. It's very ambitious. A brief pause, the sound of Sophie in the background explaining something with great authority. She says to tell you it's going to be ready when you get back and you're going to be very impressed. I definitely will be, Logan said. He drove back to Chicago with the radio off this time, thinking about the project and about Robert Vance and, briefly and without particular drama, about Isabella Sterling. He thought about her question, the one she'd emailed, the one about how he did it, how he stayed unbothered. He'd told her the truth, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't indifference. He'd told her he had somewhere to be, which was also true. What he hadn't told her, because it wasn't something you could explain in a text exchange without it sounding like a fortune cookie, was that the unbotheredness wasn't the goal. The goal was Sophie. The goal was being the kind of father she deserved. Everything else, including the performance of dignity in a bank lobby while a stranger made sounds about his withdrawal amount, was just the side effect of knowing what you were actually doing there. He'd been devastated when Derek had done what he'd done. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, even now, even when the story had enough distance to feel like something that had happened to a younger version of himself. He had not been unbothered. He had been, for a significant period, genuinely undone. Not publicly, not in ways that anyone outside his very small circle would have seen, but privately, thoroughly, in the specific way of someone who has structured their entire professional existence around a person and then had to deconstruct that structure from the inside out. He had been angry for a long time. He had been sad for longer than the anger. He had spent months in an apartment that had previously been a place he loved and had become a place full of the evidence of his own poor judgment, and he had not handled it gracefully in all the ways he would have liked. He'd had a period of 6 weeks where he drank more than he should have and called his mother too late at night and said things that weren't false but weren't helpful. He'd spent a long time unable to look at his own work without seeing it as the thing that had made him vulnerable, which was the cruelest trick grief plays, making you suspicious of your own strengths. And then Sophie had come. Not as a rescue. He was careful about that narrative, even privately, because it flattened both of them, made her responsible for his recovery in a way that was unfair to a child who had done nothing except be born, and made his recovery dependent on her in a way that wasn't stable. But she had arrived at the specific moment when he'd been building himself back up from component parts, and the requirements of being her father had given the reconstruction a shape and a direction that it might not otherwise have found as quickly. You couldn't grieve yourself into immobility when someone needed dinner. You couldn't let your anger at the world curl inward when there was a small person looking at the world with total openness, and you were the person she looked to for cues about what it meant. You had to decide, every day, what you were going to model. And he had decided, imperfectly and with regular failures that he tried to fix and sometimes didn't fix in time, to model the version of a person he'd have wanted someone to be for him, once. Someone steady. Someone honest. Someone who said, no, baby, we didn't do anything wrong and meant it completely, because he'd done the work of actually believing it. He pulled into his neighborhood just after noon. The trees were bare now, November bare, and the street had the clean, stripped-down look of a city preparing for winter. He parked and walked up to his front door and unlocked it and was met immediately by Sophie at a volume that suggested she had been waiting behind the door. "Come see," she said, grabbing his hand with both of hers. Carol stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who had spent 3 hours supervising a construction project and felt good about the results. "She did most of it herself," Carol said. "I just handed things." The boat was in the living room. It was made from 2 large appliance boxes that had been taped together in a way that was structurally creative and geometrically debatable, with a cardboard tube taped to one end as a mast and a piece of red construction paper attached to it as a sail. The interior had been furnished with 2 throw pillows and a stuffed elephant named Gerald, who was apparently the first mate. It was, objectively, a very good boat. "What do you think?" Sophie demanded. Logan crouched down and examined it seriously. He looked at the tape work. He looked at the mast. He looked at Gerald, who was situated with considerable dignity against the portside pillow. "I think," he said, "that this is the best boat I've ever seen." Sophie's face did the thing it did when she was trying not to look too pleased with herself and failing. "I know," she said. He laughed, which was the right response, and she laughed too, and Carol said she'd let herself out and did. And Logan sat in the boat with his daughter and her stuffed elephant for the better part of an hour, discussing the imaginary geography of wherever they were sailing and the real world with its projects and its apologies and its quiet, complicated human mathematics was exactly as far away as it needed to be. The project materials from Vance arrived in Logan's email on Monday morning. He read through them over 2 evenings, making notes in the margins of printed pages because he'd never fully trusted himself to think on screens. The project was real. The need it addressed was real. The capital structure made sense, though there were 2 assumptions in the financial model that he thought were optimistic, and one that he thought was conservative in a way that undersold the upside. He wrote back to Vance on Wednesday with his notes and a single paragraph at the end. "Subject to the revised projections on municipal timeline and the question I've flagged about the Series A structure, I'm interested in discussing this further. I'm comfortable with the Sterling Capital involvement given what I know of their work, though I'd want to understand her role in the operational oversight, specifically before committing to a co-lead structure." He reread that last sentence twice before sending it. It was accurate. It was also, he recognized, a door left partially open, not toward anything in particular, but toward the possibility of something, which was as much as he could honestly offer at this point. He pressed send and went to make Sophie's lunch. She was at the kitchen table coloring with a focus that suggested the fate of the world depended on getting the shading right on what appeared to be a purple dinosaur. She did not look up when he came in, which he'd learned meant she was in the deepest layer of concentration, and he should leave her there. He made her sandwich, the one she liked, with the crust cut diagonally, not straight because the diagonal made it taste better, which was not true, and was completely true. He put it on the table beside her. "Thanks, Dad," she said without looking up. "Welcome, Soph," he said. The November light came through the kitchen window and sat on the table in a pale yellow square. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. Ordinary, unremarkable, irreplaceable. Logan stood at the counter and drank his coffee and watched his daughter color her dinosaur with the absolute commitment of someone for whom this was the only thing happening in the world. He thought, "This is what I rebuilt it for." Not the investments, not the quiet reputation, not the Lakeshore portfolio, not whatever Vance's project was going to become. Those were the scaffolding. This was the building, this kitchen, this light, this kid who cut her sandwich on the diagonal and named her stuffed elephant Gerald and built ambitious boats out of cardboard and trusted him every single day with the whole weight of her understanding of what the world was. He had come out the other side of the worst thing that had happened to him, and he had arrived here. It wasn't perfect. His back hurt from sleeping on a mattress he kept meaning to replace. The cardboard boat was currently taking up 30% of his living room. He had a call at 3 that he wasn't looking forward to, and he'd forgotten to buy milk again, and the cookie dough for Carol's oatmeal cookies was still theoretical. It was not perfect. It was exactly what he'd chosen. Robert Vance called Isabella on a Thursday morning, 11 days after her Milwaukee meeting, and told her Logan Hart had responded positively to the project materials with the notes that Vance described as The most technically precise feedback I've received on this in 4 months of conversations. He flagged 2 assumptions in the financial model, Vance said. Both of them things I'd been quietly uncomfortable with and hadn't articulated yet. That's a useful person to have in a room. It is, Isabella said. She was standing at her office window with her coffee, the late November sky, the particular shade of white that Chicago got when Snow was thinking about it but hadn't committed. What happens next? I'd like to get you both in a room. Not a formal structure yet. Just a conversation. See if the collaboration makes sense before I design around it. A pause. Is that going to be a problem? No, she said. It came out steadier than she felt, which was close enough. Good. I'll send times. She set the phone down and looked at the white sky for a while. She had known this was coming. Logan's response to Vance had been, by all logic, inevitable, given what she'd learned about the project and about him. The project was exactly the kind of thing he invested in. The structure was right. The people were credible. Of course, he'd said yes. She'd said yes too, immediately, without the week of deliberation he'd taken. She wasn't sure what that said about either of them. What she was less clear on was what the room would feel like. She had emailed him twice and received 2 replies that were honest and not unkind, and that was the entirety of their actual exchange. She had apologized, and he had accepted it with more grace than she'd deserved. But an email apology and a shared conference table were different things. In person, you couldn't edit yourself. You couldn't take 40 minutes to find the right 4 sentences. You just had to be whoever you were and hope it landed okay. She was not entirely sure these days who she was. She was working on it. The working on it was ongoing and imperfect, and some days went better than others. Last week David had told her, slightly cautiously, that she seemed different lately, and when she'd asked different how, he'd said less, and stopped, and she'd said less what, David? And he'd said less like you've already decided what's going to happen before it happens. She'd sat with that for a day and a half. Marcus had just said, good different or bad different. David had said he thought good, but he wasn't sure yet, and she'd appreciated the honesty enough to not fire him for the hesitation. Chad. The meeting was set for the 2nd Wednesday of December, in a small conference room in a neutral building in the West Loop that Vance's assistant had booked. Neither Sterling Capital's office nor Logan's space, wherever that was, which felt intentional and right. Vance himself flew in from Milwaukee that morning, arriving with a legal pad and a thermos of coffee that he explained he'd made himself because hotel coffee was a character flaw. Logan was already in the room when Isabella arrived. This surprised her slightly. She'd been deliberately early, a habit so ingrained she'd stopped noticing it, and he'd beaten her anyway. He was sitting on the far side of the conference table with a folder of printed pages in front of him and a pen in his hand and reading glasses that she hadn't expected. And he looked up when she came in with an expression that was, she registered this quickly, trying to be accurate about it, not unfriendly, and not the careful neutral of someone managing their reaction. Just present. The same quality she'd noticed in the bank lobby. A person who was actually in the room he was in. Miss Sterling, he said. Mr. Hart. She set her bag down. You can call me Isabella. Logan, he said, and went back to his page for a moment before setting it down. He took his glasses off. They were nothing special, wire-framed, the drugstore kind. I reread the municipal timeline section last night. The projection on the Cook County contract has a problem. She sat down. I saw that too. The assumed approval window is 8 weeks. It's been running 14 to 18 on comparable contracts. He looked at her directly for the first time. Not reassessing exactly, more like confirming something he'd already suspected. What's your read on Vance's response if we tell him the timeline needs to be rebuilt? He'll want to hear the reasoning before he reacts, she said. He's not someone who gets defensive when the math changes. He gets defensive when you've known the math was wrong and waited to say it. Logan picked up his pen. That's consistent with what I know of him. He wrote something in the margin of his printed page. What's your involvement been so far? Vance told me you had a full meeting, but he didn't say how deep you went on the operational side. I went deep on the municipal relationship structure and the capital layering, she said. I left the technical architecture questions because I knew I was out over my skis there. She paused. That's your territory. He looked up again. You could have tried to cover it. I know, I decided not to. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not a transformation, just a small adjustment, the way a room looks different when someone opens a window. He nodded once and looked back at his notes. Vance came in 4 minutes later, thermos in hand, shook both their hands, sat down, and looked between them with the attentiveness of someone who had arranged a meeting and was reading the room before the meeting technically started. You've already been talking, he said. It wasn't a question. We found a problem in your Cook County timeline, Isabella said. Vance set his thermos down and picked up his pen. Show me, he said. Tachas. They were in the room for 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was not a comfortable meeting, particularly. Vance's project had real problems, and they found most of them in the first 90 minutes. And Vance received each one with the expression of a man who is discovering that the house he thought was sound has more structural issues than anticipated, and who is deciding, in real time, whether to fix them or walk away from the property. He did not walk away. He asked questions and took notes, and at one point said, I've been looking at this for 4 months. How did you get there in 2 hours? And Logan said without particular modesty, because we were looking for problems. You were looking for a deal. Vance pointed at him with his pen. That's fair, he said. The dynamic in the room was something Isabella had not entirely anticipated. She'd expected to feel the awkwardness of proximity to someone she'd wronged and half understood through research and a handful of texts. She'd expected some version of performance, hers or his, or both. The kind of careful professional theater that people put on when there's personal history in a business context. What actually happened was that they were both too focused on the problem to perform very much. Logan worked from technical depth outward. He understood the infrastructure layer of what Vance was building with the intuitive fluency of someone who'd actually built something like it before. And he moved through the project's architecture the way you move through a house you've lived in, knowing where the weight-bearing walls were and which floors had been patched rather than fixed. Isabella worked from the market and relationship side inward. She knew the municipal contracting environment, knew the institutional players, knew where the political friction points were likely to emerge and how long they'd take to navigate. Neither of them covered both ground. Neither of them tried to. They disagreed twice. Both times directly, both times briefly, and both times arrived at something better than either starting position through the disagreement. Vance watched this happen with the expression of someone keeping a very private score. At 2:30, they took a break. Vance stepped out to take a call. Isabella poured herself water from the pitcher on the credenza, and Logan stretched and leaned back in his chair in a way that suggested his back was bothering him, which she noted and did not mention. You flagged the Series A structure issue to Vance before this meeting, she said. It wasn't an accusation. Yes. You could have saved it for today, used it as the first move. He considered this for a moment. I could have, he said, but it was a problem that needed fixing, not a card to play. She turned her water glass between her hands. I would have saved it, she said. 6 months ago, I would have saved it. He looked at her with the direct quality she was getting used to. Not uncomfortable, just unfiltered. What about now? I'd like to think I wouldn't, she said. I'm less certain than I'd like to be. He was quiet for a moment, not filling the silence reflexively, which she'd noticed was something he did, allowed silences to exist without getting anxious about them. That's probably the right amount of certainty, he said. Being completely sure you've changed is usually a sign you haven't examined it closely enough. She looked at him. Is that something you know from experience? Yeah, he said simply. Vance came back in. They went back to the problem. The moment passed, absorbed into the larger afternoon, but it had existed and it had been real. And Isabella filed it away with the other things she was slowly accumulating about the kind of person Logan Hart actually was, as opposed to the kind she'd assumed on a Tuesday in October. The meeting ended at 3:45. Vance gathered his legal pad, which was now dense with notes on both sides of multiple pages, and said he'd need 2 weeks to restructure the financial model with the revised assumptions and would send a revised proposal before Christmas. He shook their hands again and left first, with the purposeful exit of a man who had somewhere to go and things to rethink. Isabella and Logan packed up in the small conference room in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "You drove?" she said, mostly because she'd seen his keys on the table. "Yeah, Sophie's with a neighbor until 6, so I have a window." He zipped his bag. "You?" "I walked. The office is 8 blocks. He nodded. They moved toward the door. The hallway outside was empty, the building the kind of commercial space that empties out around 3:30 as the people who'd come for midday meetings dispersed back to their actual offices. At the elevator, Logan pressed the button and they stood side by side in the way of people who have spent 4 hours in close professional proximity and are now navigating the transition back to the ordinary world. "You were right about the Cook County timeline," he said. "Your number, the 14 to 18 weeks? Where'd you get that?" "We had a deal 2 years ago that went through the same approval process. It took 16 weeks and nearly killed the close." She paused. "I learned to add 6 weeks to any Chicago municipal projection that starts under 10. I'll remember that." The elevator came. They got in. He pressed lobby. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He glanced at her the same way he had in the conference room when she'd asked things, not guarded, just attentive. "You can. The note you sent Vance. You said you were comfortable with Sterling Capital's involvement, but you wanted to understand my role in the operational oversight before committing to a co-lead structure." She'd memorized the phrasing because it had lodged in her. "What would make you not comfortable with it?" He was quiet for a beat. The elevator descended. "If I thought you were going to use the project to get access to the relationships it opens rather than to actually build the thing it's supposed to build," he said. "That's the version I was checking for." And I don't think that's what you're doing," he said. "The way you came at the problems today, you were trying to fix them, not position around them." He paused. "That matters to me." The elevator opened. They walked through the lobby and out onto the street, where the December cold arrived immediately and without apology. The West Loop at 4 in the afternoon was moving fast. Delivery trucks, cyclists in the cold, people walking with the particular purpose of people who need to be somewhere warmer. "I have a question for you," he said. She looked at him. "The bank," he said. "Not that day, and I mean what you thought when you walked in, what you actually saw when you looked at me." She didn't look away, which cost something. "A man withdrawing a small amount," she said. "Wrinkled jacket, old shoes, a kid that was taking up space in the line." She paused. "I did the math that people do. I assumed I knew the answer." "What was the answer you assumed?" "That you didn't belong there, or—" She stopped, tried to be more accurate. "That you were below a certain threshold, that your time wasn't worth the same as the other people's in that room." He nodded, not like he was surprised, more like she'd confirmed something he'd wanted confirmed. "Okay," he said. "That's all? Okay." "I asked because I wanted to know if you'd answer honestly," he said. "You did." He glanced down the street, checking the time on the phone he'd pulled from his pocket. "I need to go get Sophie." "Right." She pulled her coat tighter. "Logan." He looked up. "I know the apology already happened. I know we're past it. But I want you to know that I've been thinking about what it was actually like. For you. That day. Not just what I did wrong, but what it felt like to be on the other side of it." He was still for a moment. The cold moved around them. The city moved around them. The ordinary December afternoon continued to happen without waiting for anyone. "I know," he said. "How?" "Because you said your daughter heard it. In your email," he said. "You could have just said you said something unkind, but you said specifically that Sophie heard it. That means you understood which part of it actually mattered." She didn't have anything to say to that. She nodded. "Take care of yourself," he said, and walked toward the parking garage across the street. She watched him go for a moment. The old jacket, the slightly uneven gait of someone whose back was definitely bothering him. A man walking toward his car at 4 in the afternoon to go pick up his daughter. and then turned and walked the 8 blocks back to her office in the December cold, thinking about which part actually mattered. 2 days later, the other shoe dropped. Isabella found it entirely by accident. She was going through a financial newsletter she subscribed to, a small, high-quality publication aimed at institutional investors, the kind of thing that got forwarded around specific circles rather than marketed broadly. And there was a brief item in the back, the kind that was almost a footnote, about a settlement in a commercial dispute that had been finalized in late November. The parties were unnamed in the newsletter's description, which was standard for settlement coverage. But the description of the original dispute was specific enough: a technology company, a co-founder dispute, a contested acquisition proceeding, Cook County commercial courts, that Isabella went still at her desk and read it twice and then pulled up the Cook County Court Records portal on her other screen. It took 20 minutes to find it. The case had been filed 3 years ago and had moved slowly through the system the way civil commercial cases do, without urgency, with many continuances. The plaintiff was listed as Logan J. Hart. The defendant was Derek A. Chandra. The nature of the dispute was described in the public record with the bloodless precision of legal language: breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of partnership assets, fraudulent inducement. The settlement amount was sealed, but the case had been resolved 6 weeks ago. After 3 years of litigation that Logan had apparently been conducting in complete silence alongside everything else, the investments, the parenting, the quiet rebuilding, the legal reckoning for what Derek Chandra had done had finally, in a courtroom that had never made the news, reached its conclusion. She sat back from her screen. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about what it meant to carry a thing like that for 3 years. Not the anger, necessarily, but the active weight of a lawsuit, the depositions and filings and attorneys, and the periodic requirement to revisit the worst professional experience of your life in formal legal language, while simultaneously raising a 6-year-old and rebuilding a portfolio and showing up to bank lobbies in an old jacket to withdraw $50 for ice cream. She thought about what it meant that he had never mentioned it. Not in the emails, not in the conference room, when she'd specifically asked him about his experience, and he had answered with characteristic honesty about what trust cost. He could have told her about the case. It would have been relevant context. It would have perhaps made her understand more completely what she was apologizing to when she wrote that 6-sentence email. He hadn't said a word. She thought about why, and she thought she understood after a while. Because it wasn't the story he wanted to be telling, because the lawsuit was the past tense of something that had happened to him, and Logan Hart did not appear to be a man who organized himself around what had happened to him. He organized himself around what he was doing now, the investments he was making, the project Vance was assembling, the cardboard boat in his living room that was presumably still there, Gerald still on duty at the portside pillow. The settlement was not public. She had found it in public records, but only because she'd known what to look for. She thought about whether to mention it to him. She sat with the question for the rest of the afternoon and arrived by 6 o'clock at a clear answer. No, it was his story. He'd chosen not to tell it to her, and that was a choice she owed him the respect of not overriding. But she thought about Derek Chandra, sitting somewhere in the city or out of it, having had the monetary consequences of what he'd done formalized in a settlement he'd agreed to after 3 years of litigation. She thought about whether that was justice or just resolution, and she decided that in her experience, those two things rarely occupied exactly the same space. Marcus noticed she was distracted again on Friday. He didn't say so directly. He'd gotten subtler about it since the conversation 2 weeks ago. He just put her afternoon coffee on her desk without being asked and closed the door quietly on his way out, which was his version of giving her space. She didn't call Logan. She didn't email him. She did something she hadn't done in a long time, which was to close her laptop at 5:45 on a Friday, put her coat on, walk out of the office, and not think about work for the hour it took her to walk from the office to her apartment, which was not a walk she usually took because she usually had calls scheduled for the commute. She walked. The city was cold and lit up with December lights along Michigan Avenue, and the lake was gray-black to her right when she crossed the bridge, and there were people everywhere going about the particular hurried warmth of a Friday evening in December, shopping and eating and meeting each other and walking dogs. And she walked through all of it slowly enough to actually see it. She thought about what she was building. Not sterling capital. She knew what she was building there, and it was going well by any metric she'd previously used to measure well. She thought about the other kind of building, the kind you couldn't put on a balance sheet. She had spent 10 years learning to identify what was worth investing in. She had not, she was understanding now, applied that same rigor to herself, to the structure of how she operated, the assumptions that ran underneath everything, like the infrastructure Logan would have described as foundational, silent, invisible, the layer that everything else depended on. She'd let some bad architecture stay in place because it was functioning well enough, and tearing it out and replacing it was expensive and time-consuming, and she'd been busy. She was starting to understand the cost of leaving it there. She got home, changed out of her work clothes, made herself dinner that she actually sat down to eat. Not at her desk, not on a call, at her kitchen table with no screen open. It was pasta, badly seasoned initially, and then slightly better after she added more salt. She ate it and looked at her kitchen and thought about what she wanted the next 10 years to look like. Not professionally. She knew what she wanted professionally. She was good at that part. The other part. She thought about a man who had decided what was real and organized his life around it. She thought about what that process had cost him and how long it had taken and how it had looked like nothing from the outside. Just a quiet guy in an old jacket holding his daughter in a bank line, which was the least impressive possible surface for the amount of actual work that had gone into becoming that person. She thought about the kind of person she wanted to become and whether she was currently moving toward or away from her. She didn't have a clean answer. She was getting more comfortable not having clean answers, which was itself a kind of progress. She washed her dish. She watched an hour of television, which she rarely did. She went to bed at 10:30, which was medically responsible and personally unprecedented. She slept for 8 hours. The revised project materials from Vance arrived on December 19th, 3 days before the office closed for Christmas. He'd rebuilt the financial model with the corrected timeline and sent a revised structure document that addressed the Series A issue Logan had flagged and the municipal relationship framework Isabella had outlined. There was a note at the top of his email: better, significantly better. I'll admit the first version had more optimism than rigor. This is the version I should have built 4 months ago. Isabella read through it over a morning coffee and found it substantially improved. She sent back 3 small comments, all minor. Logan's comments arrived in her inbox 40 minutes after hers, copied to Vance. She had not known he was reviewing it simultaneously. His 3 comments were different from hers. Technical, where hers had been structural, and together they covered almost everything that needed covering. She looked at the 2 emails side by side in her inbox. Complementary, not identical, not redundant. The specific combination of her read and his read produced something more complete than either separately. She sent Logan a direct message, not copying Vance, just him. I just looked at both our sets of notes side by side. We covered different ground without overlapping. His reply came in 8 minutes. I noticed that too. A pause, and then, Vance picked well. She smiled at her screen. A real one, not a professional one. He did, she wrote back. Another pause. Longer. She'd put the phone down and gone back to work when it buzzed again. Merry Christmas, Isabella. She looked at the message for a moment. It was simple, and it was genuine, and it had none of the complicated weight of everything that had preceded it. The bank, the apology, the conference room, the research, the document she'd found in the court records that she would never mention. It was just a person wishing another person a decent holiday. She typed, Merry Christmas, Logan. Tell Sophie Gerald has excellent maritime instincts. A longer pause. Then, how do you know about Gerald? She laughed out loud at her desk. Actually laughed, the kind that surprised you. Marcus, passing the open door, looked in with the expression of someone who had not heard that sound from this office in a while. She typed, I have my sources. She set the phone down and looked out at the December sky over Chicago, gray and cold and full of the city's permanent hum. She had a lot of work left to do. On the project, on the numbers, on herself, on the slowly shifting architecture of how she moved through rooms full of people she hadn't learned to actually see yet. She wasn't done. She wasn't close to done. But she was working on it. That had to count for something. Outside, the city went on. Ordinary, imperfect, full of people carrying things that didn't show on any surface. The lake sat cold and enormous at the edge of everything, indifferent to the skyline, older than all of it, going about its own business in its own time. Somewhere in the northwest side of the city, in a house with a cardboard boat in the living room, a man named Logan Hart was reading his daughter a story. Or she was reading it to him. She'd been working on that, the reading, with the same focused commitment she brought to everything. He'd sit beside her on the bed and follow along while she found the words, not rushing her, not finishing her sentences, just present the way he was present for things that mattered. Gerald would be on the nightstand. The light in the room would be warm and yellow and small. Outside the window, December would be doing what December does. And that would be enough. More than enough. Exactly enough. The specific measure of a life that has been stripped to what's real and built back up from there, with no audience and no announcements and nothing to prove to anyone except the 6-year-old who believed, without condition or complication, that her father was someone worth believing in. He was. That was the whole of it. January arrived in Chicago the way it always did, without ceremony and without mercy. The city contracted in the cold. People moved faster and looked up less. The lake turned the color of old pewter and the wind off it had a personal quality, like it was specifically unhappy with you. Logan scraped ice off his windshield at 7:15 on a Thursday morning while Sophie watched from inside the storm door with her coat already on, her backpack on, her lunchbox in hand, ready in the way she was always ready, completely, with no remaining steps, while he was still catching up. "You're slow," she observed through the glass. "I'm thorough," he said. "That's the same thing, but slower." He looked at her through the frosted window. She was 6 and already winning arguments. He wasn't sure how he felt about this as a long-term development, but in the short term it was difficult not to respect. They drove to school through the gray January morning, Sophie narrating a complicated ongoing story involving Gerald and a sea voyage that had begun sometime around Christmas and now apparently involved a kraken. Gerald's maritime instincts, which Isabella had referenced in her Christmas message, had proven themselves under pressure. The kraken had been outwitted through a combination of strategic thinking and what Sophie described as very loud yelling. "Gerald yelled at the kraken," Logan said. "He has a very big voice," Sophie said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. "For an elephant." "Of course," Logan said. He dropped her at school, watched her walk through the front doors without looking back. She never looked back, had never been a looking back kid, which was either healthy independence or slightly devastating depending on the morning, and drove back through the cold to the kitchen table where his coffee was still hot and the Vance project materials were spread across one end in the organized chaos that was his version of a filing system. January was, it turned out, when the real work began. Vance had moved the project into an active phase in the first week of the new year, formalizing the structure with Logan and Isabella as co-leads and himself as the primary capital source with a small number of additional institutional investors who had been circling the deal for months. The revised model, corrected timeline, restructured Series A, the municipal relationship architecture that Isabella had mapped and Logan had stress-tested, had gone to those investors in late December and come back with enough interest to move forward. The first real working meeting was a video call on January 8th, which was nobody's favorite format, but which was practical given that Vance was in Milwaukee, Logan was working from his kitchen, and Isabella was in her office. Marcus had apparently been designated the person who made sure Isabella's technology worked, which she resented slightly and was grateful for in practice. Logan had his reading glasses on when the call connected. Isabella was in her usual office chair with her usual posture. Vance had his legal pad. They had learned something in December, in the conference room, in the separate document reviews, in the complimentary notes they'd sent to Vance, and it carried into January. They worked better when they weren't trying to occupy the same space. Not physically, though that too, but methodologically. Logan went deep and narrow. Isabella went wide and fast. When they stopped trying to operate in the same register and started operating in their own and then comparing notes, the work moved in a way that neither of them could have produced independently. This was not a seamless discovery. There were frictions. The first significant one happened on a Tuesday afternoon in January on a call about the Cook County relationship strategy. Isabella had drafted an approach that leaned on direct outreach to 2 specific commissioners she had existing relationships with. Logan had read the draft and sent back 4 questions, all of which were good questions. The last of which was, is there a risk that the direct outreach signals more urgency than we want to signal at this stage? She had read this and felt briefly the flicker of irritation that came when someone questioned a judgment call she'd made from experience. She had typed a reply and deleted it, and typed another one. The second one was better. Legitimate concern, she'd written. My read is that the relationship context overrides the urgency signal. These are people I've worked with before, and they'll read it as routine rather than desperate. But I want to flag that I could be wrong about that. I've been wrong about reads before. She'd paused before adding, you know that about me. His reply had come back in 6 minutes. I do. And I think you're probably right here. The relationship context is the variable I was missing. Send the outreach. She had sent it. Both commissioners had responded within 48 hours, and the tone of the responses had been exactly what she'd predicted. Collegial, curious, not pressured. Logan had sent her a 1-line message when she forwarded him the replies. Good read. She'd read that 2 words and felt something she was slowly identifying as the specific satisfaction of being understood by someone whose opinion was worth something. It was a different feeling than being praised by someone who needed something from you, which was most of the praise she received. It had weight to it. The second friction point was more significant and happened in person. Vance had called them both to Milwaukee in mid-January for a meeting with the institutional investors who were coming into the deal. It was the first time Logan and Isabella had been in the same room since December, and it was a different kind of room. Formal, populated, the kind of meeting where reputations were in play in the most direct sense. There were 6 investors around the table, all of them experienced, several of them the kind of experience that came with the particular impatience of people who had been right too many times to enjoy being questioned. Vance opened. Logan presented the technical framework. Isabella presented the market and relationship structure. It was going well. It was going well until one of the investors, a man named Arthur Keel, late 60s, silver-haired, the specific brand of imperious that came with 40 years of being the smartest person in whatever room he chose to enter, stopped Isabella mid-presentation with a question that was technically a question and was actually a challenge. The Cook County projections, he said, 14 to 18 weeks for municipal approval. That seems conservative relative to what I've seen on comparable deals. It's accurate relative to what I've lived through on comparable deals, Isabella said. She kept her voice even. We had a deal 2 years ago that took 16 weeks through the same process. The 14 to 18 window accounts for the current commissioner workload, which has increased since the Southside Corridor project came online in September. The Southside Corridor project, Keel repeated, with the particular inflection of someone implying doubt without stating it. Yes, it's created a backlog in the municipal approval pipeline that's running about 6 weeks beyond pre-project averages. She paused. I can send you the documentation if you'd like to review it. I'd like to hear from Mr. Hart on this, Keel said, with the smooth redirect of someone who had decided he preferred a different voice, since he has the technical background. Logan looked at Isabella first. A glance, brief, but she caught it, not asking permission, but registering the moment, acknowledging it. I think Ms. Sterling's numbers are correct, Logan said, and his voice was the same steady register it always was, the one that didn't perform certainty but simply had it. She walked me through the Southside Corridor backlog analysis in December, and I reviewed the underlying data. The 14 to 18-week window is conservative in the right direction, meaning the risk is that it takes longer, not shorter. He paused. If your concern is that we're padding the timeline unnecessarily, I understand that instinct. But in this case, the padding reflects real friction in the system that we've both verified. Keel looked at Logan for a moment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating which opponent he was dealing with. He looked back at Isabella. Send me the documentation, he said. Already done, she said. She'd sent it to his assistant that morning on a hunch that was less a hunch and more a pattern recognition built from 10 years of rooms like this one. Keel looked at his copy. He nodded, once. The meeting moved on. During the break, standing at the coffee credenza at the side of the room, Logan was beside her and said quietly, You knew he was going to push on that. I knew someone was going to push on it, she said. Keel specifically, because he came in with the energy of someone who'd already decided the timeline was wrong
and was waiting to say so. She poured coffee. You didn't have to back me up. I backed up the number, he said. The number was right. He redirected to you because he thought I'd padded it, she said, and because... She stopped. Because you're 30 and you're a woman, and he's been the smartest person in rooms like this for 40 years, and his instinct was to check your work with someone who looked more like him, Logan said with the bluntness of someone stating a fact about weather. She looked at him. You noticed that? I notice most things, he said. He picked up his coffee. You handled it before I said anything, for the record. I know, she said, but I'm glad you said it anyway. He nodded, and they went back to the table, and the meeting continued, and Arthur Keel did not question Isabella's numbers again. But Vance pulled Logan aside after the meeting, while Isabella was speaking with one of the other investors in the hallway. You two are going to be interesting to watch, Vance said, with a quality that was close to satisfaction. Meaning? Logan said. Meaning I've put a lot of people together in rooms over the years and told myself I was building collaborative structures, and mostly what I've built was two people competing for authority in close proximity. He glanced toward the hallway where Isabella's voice was audible, measured, and clear. This isn't that. Logan considered this. We've had frictions, he said. I know. You've worked through them. Vance picked up his thermos. That's the hard part. Most people avoid them. You two go straight at them. He paused. I think that's her influence, mostly. She's different than she was 6 months ago, from what I understand. What do you understand about 6 months ago? Logan asked. Vance looked at him directly. Dana Forsyth told me about the bank, he said. I want you to know I didn't ask. She told me because she thought I should know the context if I was putting you both in a room together. He paused. I hope that's all right. Logan was quiet for a moment. Outside the conference room windows, Milwaukee in January was flat and white and cold. It's all right, he said. She's done real work since then, Vance said. Not just professional adjustment, the other kind. He paused. I don't know if that matters to you. It matters, Logan said. He said it simply, without elaboration. Vance nodded. They left it there. February brought the real test of what they were building. The Cook County outreach had opened into a formal presentation slot with the Municipal Infrastructure Committee in late January, which was faster than any of them had predicted. Commissioner Reyes, one of Isabella's contacts, had moved it up the calendar through a procedural path that Isabella had known was available and had mentioned to Logan in a Tuesday call as a possibility, and that Logan had then spent 40 minutes researching independently because that was how he operated, needing to understand the thing from the inside before he trusted it. You looked it up, she said when he'd mentioned it. I look everything up, he said. I know, she said. It's not a criticism. The presentation to the committee was scheduled for the second Thursday of February. It was a genuine high-stakes moment, not the highest-stakes thing either of them had done professionally, but high stakes in the specific way of a thing that was real and had real consequences, and where failure would mean not just a deal falling through, but the actual people the project was designed to serve. Regional logistics infrastructure, supply chain reliability for smaller municipalities that didn't have the capital to attract large institutional investment on their own. Those people not getting what they needed for another several years while someone else assembled another attempt. Logan thought about this in the specific way he thought about things that mattered. Clearly, without drama, but with full weight. He had never been able to separate investment from consequence the way some investors did. The way that treated capital allocation as a game of numbers with human outcomes as a side note. He'd tried early on because the field seemed to require it. He'd concluded that it was not something he was capable of doing, and that rather than fighting his incapacity, he should make it structural. He invested in things that did something real. He avoided things that only made money. The Vance project was the clearest example yet of something that was both. He prepared for the presentation the way he prepared for everything. Thoroughly, alone, at the kitchen table at night after Sophie was in bed, going through the materials until they were not materials he was reading, but things he understood from the inside, turning them over in his mind the way you turn a problem over until it becomes familiar enough to stop being threatening. On the Tuesday before the Thursday presentation, Isabella called him. Not emailed, called.
He answered on the second ring. Hey, I've been going through the opening framework, she said, no preamble, and I think we have the order wrong. We're starting with the capital structure, and I think we should start with the infrastructure gap. The committee already knows there's money available. They need to believe we understand the problem before they'll trust us with it. He was quiet for a moment. He'd had the same thought 3 hours ago and hadn't said anything because he'd thought he might be wrong. I was thinking the same thing, he said. Why didn't you say something? Because I wasn't sure yet. Logan. Her voice had a quality he'd come to recognize over the past 2 months. The quality of someone who was still learning to be direct and was committing to it despite the habit of hedging. If we're doing this, you have to tell me when you think something is wrong, even if you're not sure. I know, he said. I'm working on it. So am I, she said. So we'll both work on it. He almost smiled. Okay, here's what I think about the opening structure. They were on the phone for an hour and 40 minutes. They rebuilt the opening framework from the gap analysis first, which meant restructuring 4 of the first 7 slides and rewriting the executive summary. It was not a small fix. They did it on a Tuesday night, him at his kitchen table and her at her desk, neither of them mentioning the time until she said, "It's 11:15" with mild surprise, and he said, "Yeah." And they agreed that was probably enough for tonight. Is Sophie asleep? She asked, and then immediately, "Sorry, she's been asleep since 8:30, he said. She fights it until about 8:20 and then drops like a stone. That's very efficient of her. She's efficient at everything except choosing ice cream. There was a brief pause, and then Isabella said quietly, I think about that sometimes. The ice cream. He waited. Not specifically. I think about how that was what you were there for. Not anything complicated. Just your kid wanted ice cream after school, and you were there for that. And She stopped. I made it into something. You made a sound, he said, and then you spent 3 months becoming someone who wouldn't make that sound. I think the math works out. She was quiet for a moment. Does it actually? Or are you being generous? I'm not generous with things I don't mean, he said. Ask anyone who knows me. I might, she said. Good night, Logan. Good night. He set the phone down and looked at the kitchen wall and thought about the specific texture of the past 4 months, the strange, circuitous route from a Tuesday afternoon in a bank lobby to an 11:15 phone call rebuilding a presentation framework with a woman who was, against every reasonable prediction of that Tuesday afternoon, becoming someone he found himself trusting with work that mattered to him. Not completely. He didn't trust completely anymore, say. That capacity had been damaged, and he'd stopped trying to restore it to its original state and started instead building something that worked differently, that was more distributed, more careful, more honest about its own limits. But the version of trust he was capable of now, he was extending to Isabella Sterling in the incremental and particular way of someone who had checked the work and found it solid. That was something. The Thursday presentation went well. Not perfectly. There was a moment 20 minutes in when a committee member asked a question about the environmental impact assessment that neither of them had a complete answer for, and Logan said clearly and without apology, I don't have the full data on that yet. I'll get it to you by end of week. But the imperfection of it was actually useful because it was honest, and the committee responded to honesty the way people respond to it when they're not used to getting it in formal presentations, with visible relief and increased attention. Commissioner Reyes asked most of the substantive questions. She was 62 years old and had been working in municipal infrastructure for 30 years and had a calibrated skepticism that required real answers. Isabella fielded the relationship and capital questions. Logan fielded the technical and operational ones. There was a moment, a specific moment about 40 minutes in, where Reyes asked something that was genuinely between their areas, a question about how the technical architecture interfaced with the municipal procurement process, and Isabella started to answer and then said, Actually, take that one. And Logan did. And the handoff was so fluid that Reyes noticed it and said, You two have worked together before? We've been working together for about 2 months, Isabella said. Reyes said with the brevity of someone who has seen a lot of partnerships and can tell the ones that work from the ones that are performing working. She went on to her next question.
The committee voted to advance the project to the next phase of review at the end of the meeting. In the hallway after, Vance said good work to both of them and went to find the elevator, the understated satisfaction in his voice doing more than a longer statement would have. Logan and Isabella stood in the municipal building hallway while the committee members filtered out around them, the old marble floors and fluorescent lights of a building that had been built to function rather than impress. "End of week on the environmental data," she said. "I'll have it by Wednesday," he said. "Reyes is going to read it word for word." "I know, that's why I'll have it by Wednesday." He adjusted his bag. "You were right about the opening framework." "We were right about it." He looked at her, the same direct look she'd gotten used to over 2 months of calls and documents and one shared conference room in Milwaukee. "You could have taken that," he said. "The handoff, the technical procurement question. You know enough to have answered it." "Not as well as you," she said. "That's the 3rd time in 2 months you've said a version of that. That you could have done something, but you knew I'd do it better." She met his eyes. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's just unusual." He paused. "Most people in your position spend energy making sure everyone knows what they could have done." "I used to," she said. "It was exhausting, and it didn't actually make me better at anything." He was quiet for a moment. "What changed?" She thought about the bank lobby, about the kitchen window at 3 a.m, about the diner in Milwaukee when she was 8 years old and her mother counted change on the table, about a 6-year-old asking her father if they'd done something wrong, about the way he'd answered, about all of it, the whole messy accumulating weight of 4 months of small adjustments that weren't finished and might never be finished, but were real. "Someone made me look at something I didn't want to look at," she said, "and I looked anyway." Logan nodded. He seemed to understand that the answer wasn't about him specifically, and that it was also, in a partial and honest way, about him. March came in with this particular Chicago energy of a city that has survived another winter and is not going to pretend to be gracious about it. The project had moved into its operational phase. The municipal review had advanced. The capital structure had been finalized. Logan and Isabella were both embedded in it now in the functional, unglamorous way of real work. Document reviews and calls with attorneys, and a 3-hour session on a Tuesday where they discovered an error in the tax treatment of the fund structure that required 2 days of revision and several conversations neither of them enjoyed. Real work was like that. You built something carefully, and then you found a problem inside it, and you fixed the problem, and the fixing revealed another problem, and eventually, if you were patient and rigorous and honest about what you didn't know, you arrived at something solid enough to stand on. Logan came to prefer the phone calls to the video calls. He would have found this hard to explain to anyone, but there was something about the voice without the screen that felt more honest. He'd told Isabella this once, obliquely, saying he thought the phone calls were more efficient, which was true, but not the whole truth. She'd said, "Me too," actually. And they'd moved on. On a Saturday morning in mid-March, the first Saturday of the year that felt like it was thinking about spring without quite committing to it, Logan's phone rang while he was helping Sophie with the reading assignment she'd been avoiding for 2 days. He looked at the screen. Isabella. "1 second, Soph." He stepped into the kitchen. "Hey, I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice had the quality it got when she'd been sitting with something long enough that the decision to say it was final. "And I want to say it directly rather than burying it in an email." He leaned against the counter. "Okay." "I looked up the court case," she said. "The Hart versus Chandra case. I found it in the public records in December." A pause. "I wasn't planning to. I came across a reference in a newsletter, and then I looked it up, and..." She stopped. "I've been carrying that since December, and I didn't tell you, and I think you should know that I know." He was quiet. The kitchen was very still. In the other room, Sophie was reading to herself in the low murmur of a kid sounding out words she wasn't sure of. "December," he said. "December," she confirmed. "I haven't mentioned it to anyone. I won't. It's your..." She paused. "It's your story. I just couldn't keep not telling you that I knew." He let the silence sit for a moment. He thought about December, about all the months since, about the work they'd done together, in the space where he'd known what she didn't know, and about whether that knowledge would have changed anything. He concluded it wouldn't have. Then he thought about why she was telling him now,
in March, on a Saturday morning, when she could have never said anything, and he would never have known, because she was trying to be honest, even when honesty was optional. That was the whole of it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. "You found it. You didn't use it. You told me because you felt like I should know." He paused. "What's the question?" "I don't have a question," she said. I didn't want something sitting between us that you didn't know was there." He thought about this. He thought about Derek Chandra, who had let things sit between them for years and never said anything until it was far too late for saying anything to matter. He thought about the specific cost of that kind of silence, not the dramatic cost, not the legal and financial fallout, but the quieter and earlier cost of living alongside someone who was not telling you the truth about where they stood. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Are you actually okay with it?" she said with the directness she'd been developing. "Not, are you saying you are? But are you?" He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about things. "I'm not thrilled that you know," he said. "I kept that private deliberately, but I'm okay that it was you who found it." He paused. "That's the best answer I have." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good answer," she said. "That's actually a good answer." "I know," he said, which made her make a sound that was close to a laugh, and he felt the tension of the last 3 minutes release into something easier. "Go back to whatever you were doing," she said. "I'll send the revised tax memo Monday morning." "Sophie's reading assignment," he said, "which she finds extremely unjust." "What's the assignment?" 3 pages about a boy who finds a dog. She says the plot is not believable because the dog would have found him, not the other way around. A pause. "She's not wrong," Isabella said. He laughed at that. Actual, short, surprised. "I'll tell her you said so. She'll be insufferable." "Worth it," Isabella said, and then, "Goodbye, Logan." "Goodbye," he said. He went back to the living room. Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the rug with the book, scowling at it, with a specific expression she reserved for things she'd decided were wrong, but was going to finish anyway because not finishing things was, in her moral framework, not acceptable. "Who called?" she said without looking up. "A person I work with." "The one who knows about Gerald." He sat down in the armchair. "Yeah." Sophie turned a page. "Gerald says she has good judgment," she said. He looked at his daughter. "Gerald said that." "He told me," she said, with the serenity of someone reporting established fact. "Last night." "I'll pass it along," Logan said. He watched her read for a while, the small furrow between her brows, the lips moving slightly on the harder words, the occasional indignant look she directed at the book when the plot offended her sensibilities. She was, he thought, going to be formidable when she grew up. She was already formidable now, in the ways that mattered. He thought about what he was passing on to her. Not the money. The money was a means, not an end, and he'd always been clearer on that than most people around him. Not the investments or the portfolio or whatever the Vance project would eventually become in the permanent record of things built and left behind. Those were real, and he was proud of them, and they would last in the ways that external things last. He meant the other inheritance, the one that didn't have a line on any document, the willingness to start over without bitterness, the capacity to be in a room and actually see the people in it, the understanding that being wrong about someone, being fundamentally, completely wrong about who they were and what they deserved, was not the worst thing. The worst thing was finding out you were wrong and doing nothing about it, or finding out you were wrong and treating the discovery as information about them, rather than about yourself. He had tried, imperfectly, and with regular failures, and with the specific unglamour of a person doing the work rather than performing it, to live in a way that Sophie could learn something real from. Not a lesson. He'd never liked the word lesson, with its implication of a teacher standing over a student with a pointer. Something more like a demonstration, an ongoing, unfinished, frequently flawed demonstration of what it looked like to take the worst things that happened to you and not let them become the worst things you did to other people. He didn't know if he was succeeding. He wouldn't know for years, probably. Maybe longer. Sophie turned the last page of the assignment. She closed the book. She looked at it for a moment. "The dog should have found him," she said.
You're probably right, Logan said. I'm definitely right, she said, and put the book in her backpack with the finality of someone filing away an injustice and moving on. He looked at her. This kid, this specific, impossible, wonderful kid who had no idea what her existence had cost him or what it had given him, and didn't need to know because the transaction was not between them. The transaction was between him and the person he'd been deciding to be, slowly, day by day, in the ordinary, imperfect light of an ordinary, imperfect life. What do you want to do today? He said. Sophie thought about this with appropriate gravity. I want to work on the boat, she said. Gerald thinks it needs a crow's nest. Gerald has a lot of opinions for a stuffed elephant.
He's a very opinionated elephant, she said, as if this were a quality deserving of respect. Logan got up from the armchair. Okay, he said, let's build a crow's nest. What? Spring arrived in April, quietly, without drama, the way the best things arrive. Not announced, but simply present, the air different one morning. The trees along Logan's street showing the first thin wash of green against a sky that had finally stopped being gray. The Vance project received its municipal approval in the second week of April. Vance sent a message to the full team at 7 in the morning that said we're in and nothing else, which was his version of a celebration. Isabella sent Logan a separate message at 7:04 that said, Cook County, 16 weeks exactly. He'd sent back, you're going to be insufferable about this. She'd replied, for at least a month. He didn't tell her that the insufferability was warranted, but she probably knew. He was at the kitchen table when he read it, coffee in hand, Sophie at school, the April light coming through the window at the angle that meant spring had actually arrived and wasn't just visiting. He read the exchange twice, and then he looked at the window for a while. He thought about October, the bank lobby, the marble floors and the sound of heels and the particular way a room can hold 30 people and still be full of silences, and the sound that had moved through it, and Sophie asking her question and him answering it. He thought about what had come from that, not because he'd planned for anything to come from it, not because he'd handled it with any particular grace or turned it into anything he'd intended, but because the world was smaller than it appeared and the threads between things were longer and more persistent than anyone could track. And sometimes the most consequential moments were the ones that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. He thought about Isabella Sterling walking out of that bank into the October air and stopping on the sidewalk and standing there. He thought about a woman in a coffee shop when he was 29 years old who told him 2 weeks after the Chandra situation had finalized and he was still in the acute phase of it, that the hardest thing about being wronged wasn't the wrong itself. It was what it made you want to become in response. And that every day you chose not to become that thing was a victory that nobody would ever see or credit, and you had to make peace with that being the condition. He had never fully made peace with it. He didn't think full peace was the point. He thought the point was the choosing, the daily, imperfect, sometimes furious choosing not to let it make you small. Isabella had been given the chance, after a much smaller thing, to make a different choice than the one she'd started with. She had taken it. Not perfectly, not linearly, with wrong turns and slow progress, and the particular difficulty of changing something that had been useful to you for a long time, but genuinely. That mattered. Not to his balance sheet, not to the Vance project, which would have found its shape regardless. It mattered in the register where things mattered to him most. The register of what was real, what was honest, what actually happened between people when they tried to be better than their worst moments. He got up, washed his coffee cup, put his reading glasses on the stack of papers that would need attention this afternoon, and did not think about any of it again until much later, because today Sophie's school had a half day, and he was picking her up at noon and she had requested with formal advance notice that they stop for ice cream on the way home. Galaxy Swirl was apparently back on the menu for spring. He was already looking forward to it. Some months later, Isabella would be asked, in an interview with a financial publication that was profiling her alongside 3 other investors under 40, what the most important lesson of her career had been. She would think about this for longer than the interviewer expected. She would say, I learned to look at people instead of signals. It sounds simple. It took me longer than I want to admit. The interviewer would ask what had taught her that. She would think about a bank lobby in October, about marble floors and the specific sound of $30 heels on them,
and a little girl's question hanging in the air. She would say, "Someone I underestimated, completely and badly, and in a way that was visible to him and his daughter." She would pause. He was better about it than he needed to be. That made it harder to dismiss, and I think that was the point. "What happened after?" the interviewer would ask. "We worked together," she would say. "We built something real." A pause. "And I stopped calculating what people were worth before I'd actually looked at them." Another pause. "I still do it sometimes. Old architecture is hard to fully replace, but I catch it faster now." The interviewer would write this down and move on to the next question. The interview would be published. Logan would not read it because he did not read profiles of people in his professional circle as a rule, and because he was busy. He would be at the kitchen table that afternoon helping Sophie with a project for school, a map of an imaginary country she'd invented, which had a significant coastline and a capital city named Geraldton, and a merchant fleet that Sophie was designing with considerable nautical attention to detail. He would be cutting coastline shapes out of cardboard while she drew port cities in crayon, both of them working with the serious concentration of people who understood that imaginary things deserved real effort. Gerald would be on the table, observing proceedings. The April light would come through the window, and Logan Hart would be exactly where he had decided to be, doing exactly what he had decided mattered, and the world outside would continue to operate at its usual scale, enormous and indifferent, full of money moving in invisible streams and people making assessments and the daily complicated ordinary business of human beings trying to figure out what they owed each other. And inside this kitchen, none of that would be the point. The point would be the coastline. The point would be Geraldton. The point would be Gerald keeping watch. The point had always been this: the small, stubborn, irreducible thing at the center of a life that had been stripped and rebuilt, and stripped again and built once more. Not what you accumulated, not what you were owed, not what the world understood about you from the outside, but what you chose, in the quiet and the ordinary and the Tuesday afternoons, to pour yourself into. That was the inheritance. That was what remained. That